A kind governess helps a shamed elderly man, unaware he is the Duke's father. The sound stopped Clara Whitmore mid-step. She had both hands shoved deep into her coat pockets, her breath already clouding in the bitter air, the frost-bitten gravel crunching hard and sharp under her boots, as she moved along the lane toward the Hargrove Gate at 5:05 in the morning. The sky was the kind of dark that had not yet made up its mind to become morning, a charcoal gray that offered neither comfort nor promise, just the absence of full night. She had been moving quickly, as she always did in this kind of cold, thinking about nothing of particular importance. The children's lesson plan for Tuesday, the loose button on her second good dress that had been annoying her for 3 days, whether she had enough of the good ink left to last until the next market trip. When the sound came out of the dark ahead of her, and pulled every thought clean out of her mind at once. It was low and controlled, and very brief. Not a shout, not a call, not a cry. Something quieter than any of those things and somehow worse. The sound a person produces when they are managing a very great deal of pain, and the management is beginning, at last, to slip. Clara had heard sounds like it before. Her father in the last weeks of his illness, when he thought she was in the other room. The cook at her first employer's house, who had badly scalded her hand and was trying not to let any of the children see how much it hurt. She had learned early to recognize the particular quality of a sound that was trying very hard not to be made and failing. She pushed through the gate without slowing. The man on the stone bench beyond the outer wall was bent slightly forward, one hand pressed to his brow. He was soaked through, to an extent that suggested he had been sitting in the rain for some time, not minutes but hours, and his coat hung heavy on him with the weight of all that water. She could see from 3 paces away, even in this half-darkness, even in the state it was in, that the coat had once been an excellent one. Quality did not entirely disappear under mud and rain. It left a residue. The cut of the shoulders, the spacing of the horn buttons, the remnant of a fine wool lining visible at the turned-back cuff. These things told a story as clearly as any letter. She filed the information without making much of it, the way she filed most things, in the part of her mind that kept evidence until it became useful. His hat had fallen, and lay in a small, dark puddle near his left boot. The gray hair above his left eye was matted flat with blood, where something hard had met his head. The lane, most likely, which was glazed with ice at that hour. The wound was not small. He looked up when she stopped in front of him. He had dark eyes, very steady, in a face that was otherwise not steady at all. Too pale, too tight with pain, wet through with the cold. But the eyes themselves were steady, and they looked at her with an expression that Clara spent the next several days trying to find the right word for, turning it over in quiet moments as she went about her work, placing one word against it and removing it, and trying another. It was pride, but not the ordinary kind. It was the pride that belonged specifically to a man who once stood in rooms where his word carried real consequence, where people waited for him to finish speaking before they spoke themselves, where his signature on a document meant something to strangers, where his approval or disapproval shaped how other people moved through their days. He was sitting on a stone bench in November, with blood in his hair, and soaked clothing, and shaking hands, and he knew it, and he knew she could see it, and the gulf between what he had once been, and what he was sitting in at this moment, was so visible to him, so acutely felt, that the pain of it was present in his eyes, alongside the physical pain of the wound. He had made that sound against his will. The cold had gotten through the final layer of his management and extracted it without his permission, and now she was here, a stranger, and he knew she had heard. He was managing that knowledge the same way he was apparently managing everything else this morning, by going absolutely still and giving nothing further away. Clara did not stop at 3 paces. She walked straight to the bench and crouched down in front of him so that her face was level with his, rather than standing over him, the way a person stands over a problem they are deciding how to handle. She had learned in her years with children that crouching down was sometimes the most important thing you could do, that the simple act of putting yourself at the same height as someone smaller or more vulnerable communicated, without any words at all, that you were not going to be the kind of person who used the height advantage. It communicated that the situation was in hand and that whatever came next would not be alarming. She looked at him directly, not with pity, which he would have hated, and not with the bright, performed concern that some people used to make themselves feel better about difficult situations. She looked at him the way she looked at the Hargrove children when they were genuinely hurt, with a steadiness that said, I see this, and I am not alarmed by it, and I know what to do. Can you walk? She asked. Yes, he said. His voice was low and precise. It had, even now, even through the cold and the shaking and the pain, the particular quality of a voice that people had spent a long time listening to when it spoke. Educated, yes, but more than educated, practiced in authority, in the habit of being heard. She held out her hand. She saw it, the fraction of a second, where the old self asserted itself, where the body of a man, who had spent his life not needing to take anyone's hand, tried to refuse it simply on principle. It lasted perhaps half a second. Then he took her hand, and he pushed himself up from the bench, and he got halfway to standing, before his left knee gave entirely on the ice-slicked gravel. Clara had already shifted her weight forward. She was braced when it happened, and she caught him by the arm, solid and without fuss, and held him until the knee recovered and his footing steadied. She had spent 3 years managing 3 children on staircases and garden walls, and one memorable afternoon up a large apple tree, and she was stronger than she looked, and considerably more prepared for the physical demands of an emergency than most people who met her in her professional capacity would ever guess. The frost is worst at the gate, she said. Walk with me. I know the better path. She guided him along the edge of the lane, where the gravel was clear, adjusted her pace to his, without remarking on it, and they moved together, across the estate grounds, toward the south end of the property. She did not take him to the main house. The decision had assembled itself completely in the first 20 seconds of standing at the bench, before she had consciously thought it through, the way right decisions sometimes did, complete and immediate, and already settled by the time the mind arrived to examine it. The main house meant Mr. Hargrove, and Mr. Hargrove was a man who operated by category and procedure, and the careful management of anything that might cause social inconvenience. An injured old man with no introduction and no verifiable story would require a procedure from Mr. Hargrove, and the procedure would take time. And time was something this man did not have, in the same sense that warmth and quiet were things he needed immediately. The gardener's cottage at the south boundary of the property was empty, as it was every winter. Clara had the key for it on her key ring. She had taken it in September to retrieve a pair of garden shears she needed for a children's craft project, and no one had since asked for it back, and she had kept it in the practical spirit of keeping anything that might one day be useful. She unlocked the door and got the man inside, and into the single wooden chair beside the cold stove, before he had to stop moving from necessity rather than choice. He sat, both hands on his knees, breathing in the measured, deliberate way of someone who has discovered that breath, controlled carefully, can serve as a tool against pain. That if you breathe in a particular way, you can keep the pain at a manageable distance, rather than letting it come in full and close. She was already at the stove, with the matches she kept in her coat pocket, another old habit, useful more often than most habits, laying the kindling, stacking it properly, setting the 2 blocks of wood from the stack against the exterior wall of the cottage. The flame caught on the 3rd match. She adjusted the vents, left the stove door partly open to draw the fire, and stood. I am going to the house for a few things, she said. I will be back before the fire needs feeding. Do not try to stand. She said it in the tone she used for instructions that were not negotiable, not unkindly, simply with the clarity of someone who had thought it through and arrived at the necessary position. She went. In the main house, she moved through the back passage, and the storage corridor, and the linen room, with the practiced quiet of someone used to getting things done, before the household was properly awake. From her late uncle's trunk, which she kept in the storage room for reasons that had started practical and become habitual, she took a thick flannel shirt, wool trousers, and a pair of heavy socks. Her uncle had been a man of roughly similar build, broad-shouldered, average height, and the clothes would do well enough. From the linen shelf she took 2 blankets that smelled of cedar, from the block she had placed among them in October. From the range kettle, which Mrs. Penny left on low heat overnight, so that the kitchen was never entirely cold, she filled a small covered pot with warm water. From the breadboard, she cut 2 thick rounds from the previous day's loaf. She was back at the cottage in 8 minutes and 40 seconds, which she knew, because she had counted, not from anxiety, but from the habit of measuring things. The fire had taken hold well. The cottage had already lost some of the worst of its cold. The man in the chair had not moved, but he was breathing more steadily, she thought. and the worst of the rigid tension in his body was beginning to ease with the warmth. She set the warm water and the bread on the table, and placed the dry clothes on the cot without making any remark about them. She put the blankets on the foot of the cot. She pulled the chair slightly closer to the stove and went to work on the wound at his brow. It was a cut rather than a gash, bad-looking from the blood that had dried into his hair, but not deep enough to need stitching. She had cleaned worse on the Hargrove children. She used the warm water and a clean cloth from her pocket, working carefully and without excessive apology. She had found that excessive apology during the treatment of wounds tended to make the person being treated more anxious rather than less, so she worked efficiently and without comment, and let the steadiness of her hands do what words would not have done as well. She had a small tin of calendula salve in her coat pocket, kept for the children's winter-chapped skin and minor cuts, and she applied a careful amount to the cleaned cut, and covered it with a folded strip of clean linen, secured with a length torn from the spare shirt without ceremony. He accepted all of it in silence. He was not entirely still. She could feel, through the touch required by the work, the residual shaking of his body, but the quality of the stillness was different now from the bench, less the stillness of a man bracing against exposure, and more the stillness of a man allowing himself, reluctantly but genuinely, to rest. She put the bread and the warm water in front of him. He looked at it, and she saw the familiar thing move across his face, the long-established habit of a man who was accustomed to being the one who provided, rather than the one who received, encountering an act of provision, and not quite knowing how to meet it, without the older self objecting. But he was cold, and he had been cold for a long time, and he picked up the bread, and he ate it. Slowly, carefully, in the manner of a man for whom appearing unhurried and unaffected was a discipline of long standing. He finished it all. When the bread was gone, he looked at her. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "I am governess to the Hargrove family. This cottage belongs to the estate and is unused at this time of year. You will not be disturbed here today." A pause, just long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Edward," he said, one word. One name, offered in the way a man offers the minimum of himself when the rest of it is too heavy to carry into an introduction, not because he was hiding it, but because he was, at this moment, living in the single word, the simplest version of what he was, and anything beyond it felt like a language he no longer had the energy to speak. "Good morning, Edward," she said, in exactly the tone she would have used for any introduction in any ordinary situation, because there was a dignity in treating the extraordinary as ordinary that she had learned to value. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the small book she carried there every day without exception. It had belonged to her father, a copy of Marcus Aurelius, the spine repaired twice with strips of brown paper and bookbinder's glue, the corners soft from years of handling, the pages worn to a silkiness at their edges. She placed it on the table beside the empty water pot and said nothing about it. "I will come back this afternoon," she said, and went. The morning moved as mornings do. She collected the post from the box at the lane's end, which she had failed to collect on her way out, given the distraction of the man at the bench, and brought it to Mr. Hargrove's breakfast place, and received his usual absent nod of acknowledgement. She sat at her end of the table, and drank her tea, and ate her porridge, and supervised the children's table manners, and answered Mr. Hargrove's one question about his youngest son's progress in his reading, and she did all of it with her usual composure. She was thinking about the cottage. Not with anxiety. She was not, by nature, an anxious person. She was thinking about the coat, and the quality of the voice, and the steadiness of the dark eyes, that held something large behind them. She had encountered many people in her 26 years, in her father's house before his money ran out, in her aunt's house after, in 3 different employers' households since her working life began, and she had developed, as a result, a sensitivity to the difference between people who had always inhabited their particular level of life, and people for whom that level was new. The people who had always been where they were moved through their circumstances with the ease of long familiarity. They did not think about their circumstances, they simply lived in them. The people for whom circumstances were new, up or down, had a different quality. They were more conscious. They adjusted more visibly. The difficulty, if it was difficulty, fitted them the way a coat that belonged to someone else fits. Wearable, but not quite right, and impossible entirely to forget. Edward wore his difficulty like that. like something that belonged to someone else. And a coat like his, she knew, was not the coat of a man born to difficulty. It was the coat of a man who had recently arrived in it and had not yet unpacked. She was curious. But she was not the kind of curious that required immediate satisfaction. She was the kind that could wait for things to become clear in their own time, which in her experience they almost always did, given patience and the restraint not to push. At 4 o'clock she returned to the cottage with a pot of the thick vegetable soup Mrs. Penny had made for the household's midday meal, kept warm in the covered pot she had left on the low shelf of the range, and a fresh candle, and the tin of salted crackers she kept in her room for the evenings, when she was too tired to go down to the kitchen, and wanted something to eat while she read. She knocked twice before she opened the door. She had decided, without thinking about it especially, that knocking was the appropriate thing to do. He was a person, not a situation, and people deserved a knock. He was on the cot, the blanket across his knees, the book open in his hands. He was not reading when she came in. He was looking at the open page with the particular, inward, focused expression of someone who has read something and been sent somewhere by it, somewhere the words pointed to but did not entirely reach, somewhere that existed in the reader's own memory, or pain, or hope, rather than on the page itself. He came back to the room when she closed the door. The fire had maintained itself well. She replaced the low stub of the morning's candle with the fresh one, and set the soup on the table, and he ate it with considerably more ease than he had eaten the bread that morning, the shaking entirely gone from his hands, his color much improved, the gray pinched quality around his eyes fading to something more like simple tiredness. "You carry this with you," he said when the bowl was empty, turning the book in his hands. "Every day," Clara said. He studied the cover, the worn edges, the repaired spine. "I have been reading it this afternoon." He paused. "There is a line I have not been able to move past since I read it. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to believe that quite confidently." "And now?" Clara asked, because the pause was waiting for the question. He looked at the candle flame on the shelf above the stove. He looked at it for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Now I think it is true," he said. "But I also think that knowing a thing is true, and actually living that truth in every moment of every day, are a very long distance apart from each other, perhaps a lifetime's distance, perhaps more." Clara considered this with the full attention it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I think that is exactly right." They sat in the warmth of the small room for a few minutes more without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable. Outside, the evening had come down against the cottage window, and the wood pigeon that lived in the kitchen garden made its low, round sound from somewhere beyond the yew hedge. The fire clicked. A log shifted, and a thread of bright flame briefly appeared and was gone. When Clara rose to leave, she left the crackers on the table and picked up the empty soup bowl. At the door she stopped. "The vents half open will hold the fire through the night," she said. "There is more wood in the stack outside the door, if you need it before morning. Sleep if you can." She stepped out into the cold dark and closed the door quietly behind her, and she stood on the path for a moment and listened to nothing in particular. The frost had come down harder in the last hour, and the gravel glittered underfoot in the faint light from the kitchen windows far across the grounds. She walked back. In the kitchen passage, Mrs. Penny was waiting. She was standing with her arms crossed in the manner of a woman who has been standing in one place for some time, because she has decided to stand there until a certain thing is addressed, and who has used the time to think through everything she intends to say. "The covered pot from the second shelf," said Mrs. Penny, "and 2 pieces of wood from the south stack, and bread." "Yes," Clara said. Mrs. Penny studied her with the level, evaluating expression she brought to anything she considered important. "Is anyone going to come to any harm from it?" "No," Clara said. "None at all." Mrs. Penny nodded. It was a single, decisive nod, the kind that closed a question. She stepped back from the doorway. "Supper is at 7, she said. "I have made considerably more than we will eat." And that was all that was said between them, then or subsequently. Mrs. Penny never brought the subject up again, not directly. But the amount of food available each evening was always, from that day forward, what could only be described as more than necessary. And when Clara collected what she needed from the kitchen at the end of the day, Mrs. Penny was always busy with something at the far end of the room, occupying herself with a thoroughness that made it entirely unnecessary for either of them to remark on what was happening. It was the most efficient arrangement Clara had ever entered into, conducted entirely without words. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, after the house had settled into its quiet, Clara sat at the small desk in her room, with her candle down to a comfortable height, and her hands loose in her lap, and she thought, carefully and without hurry, about what she had taken on. Not about whether she had done the right thing. She was not given to revisiting settled questions, but about the shape of what lay ahead. The man in the cottage needed more than a warm night and a bowl of soup. The warm night and the bowl of soup were necessary, and she was glad she had provided them, but they were not sufficient to address whatever the full situation was. She did not know the full situation. She had a first name and a coat and a pair of dark eyes, with something substantial behind them, and these were not sufficient information to plan with. She would need more. The more, she thought, would come if she was patient and did not push, because it almost always did. She blew out the candle. She went to bed. She was going back in the morning. The problem appeared the following morning, in the form of George. George was the Hargrove stable hand, 32 years old, broad-shouldered and methodical, with the kind of practical decency that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. He had worked the estate for 11 years and kept to a routine as fixed as the rotation of the seasons. He rose before the kitchen fire was lit, saw to the horses in the cold dark with a lantern, and walked the south perimeter of the grounds on his way from the stable to the house for his breakfast. He had done this every morning for 11 years and had no particular reason to change. He saw the smoke from the cottage chimney long before he saw anything else, just a thin thread of it, rising from the stack against the pale gray of the sky, steady and unhurried. He came around the corner of the yew hedge and saw the faint warmth of candlelight in the cottage window. He stopped. He held his lantern out in the way of a man who wants a clearer look at something before he decides what he thinks about it. Clara, approaching from the opposite direction with the morning's food wrapped in cloth, saw him standing there from 30 feet away. They looked at each other across the frost-whitened grass, without speaking for a moment, the lantern between them casting a small warm circle on the white ground. Clara walked toward him at a direct, unhurried pace. She stopped at speaking distance. "There is a man in the cottage," she said, keeping her voice low but not secretive, the tone of someone sharing relevant information rather than confessing something. "He has been there since yesterday morning. He was injured and needed shelter. I am managing it." George looked at the cottage. He looked back at her. "Does Mr. Hargrove know?" "Not yet," Clara said. "I intend to manage the situation carefully for as long as is reasonably possible." He was quiet for a moment. The lantern flame moved slightly in the cold air. "Is he dangerous?" "He is an elderly man, with a cut on his brow, and an unreliable left knee," Clara said. "He is approximately as dangerous as a church pew." George's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight movement at the corner of his mouth. He looked at the chimney again. He looked at the cottage window with its faint light. He was a man, Clara had learned in 3 years of working alongside him in the management of the estate's practical matters, who made decisions relatively quickly and then stood by them without a great deal of drama. "I don't see any smoke," he said, in a tone of complete seriousness. "Must have been the morning light fooling me." He turned and walked on toward the house without looking back. Clara stood on the frost-white grass and released a breath she had been holding without realizing it. Then she went to the cottage and knocked twice before she opened the door, because she had decided on the first morning that knocking was the right way to enter, and she intended to maintain it. He was a person. People got knocked at. Edward was up, dressed in the dry clothes she had brought. They fit him well enough, the trousers a little loose but the shirt good, and sitting on the cot with the blanket folded neatly at his feet, and the cracker tin empty on the table, and the book open on his knee. He was not reading. He was thinking, with the focused, inward expression of someone working through something complicated. He looked up when she came in. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said. The name, used now with a naturalness that had not been there on the first morning, was a small indication that something had shifted slightly in how he was inhabiting the space. He was not perfectly at ease. Clara did not think he would be at ease for some time. But he was no longer at the bare minimum of himself, the stripped-down version that had offered a single name and nothing further. "Good morning, Edward," she said. She set the morning's food on the table, tea in the flask, bread, and a piece of cold cheese that Mrs. Penny had added without comment, and checked his brow while he poured the tea. The wound was clean and closing well. She would not need to do much more to it. He ate with less of the careful discipline than the day before, not quickly. He was not a man who moved through any action quickly, but with slightly less performance of unconcern, which was its own kind of progress. Outside the cottage window, the morning had come on fully, pale and cold and very clear, the frost brilliant on the kitchen garden grass, the bare apple tree at the garden's edge holding its empty branches against a sky the color of clean linen. It would not snow today, but the cold intended to stay. It was while Clara was refilling the tea from the flask that the trouble began in a different direction. She heard voices from the direction of the Hargrove gate, the front gate, not the cottage path, and she went to the cottage window and looked. A man she did not recognize was standing at the gate speaking with Agnes, the housemaid, who had come out to take something to the post box and been stopped mid-task. The man was perhaps 40, with a neat appearance and a notebook in his hand and the general bearing of someone conducting official inquiries. He was writing something down. Agnes was listening with the wide, slightly alarmed expression of a young woman who has been approached by someone with a notebook and isn't sure what they want. Clara was at the cottage door before she had consciously decided to move. She crossed the grounds to the front gate at a pace designed to look purposeful without looking hurried, which was a thing she had practiced in various professional situations and had gotten rather good at. The man with the notebook looked up when she came through the side gate. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I am making inquiries on behalf of a family in the county. We are looking for a gentleman, an older man, perhaps in his 70th year, gray-haired, well-spoken, distinguished in appearance. He has been missing from his usual location for several days, and there is some concern for his welfare. I wondered whether anyone at this property might have seen such a man on the lane or in the surrounding area." He looked at Clara with the practiced, receptive expression of someone accustomed to reading people's reactions as much as their words. Clara looked at him with the expression she reserved for situations that required her to be extremely accurate without being entirely forthcoming. It was a very specific expression, developed over years of managing children and employers, and the various social situations that required truth, without all of the truth. "I have not seen any such person on the lane," she said. "Not recently. The lane is quiet in November." She was precise about the lane. She had, in fact, not seen Edward on the lane. She had seen him beyond the gate, at the bench against the outer wall. The distinction was thin, and she was aware of it, but she was not prepared to be more forthcoming until she understood more about who was sending men with notebooks and why. The man thanked her, wrote something in his book, and continued down the lane toward the village. Clara stood at the gate until he was around the bend. Agnes had disappeared back into the house. Clara turned and walked back toward the cottage. She told Edward about the man with the notebook when she went back inside, simply and directly, without building it up or softening it. He listened without moving, his hands on his knees, looking at the space between them rather than at her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They are looking for me," he said, not with surprise. "Someone is," Clara said, "sent by someone." "By the family," he said. The word family came out with a flatness that covered something else, in the way that flat voices sometimes do. Not out of real concern, I think. Out of management. I am a problem that requires locating. Clara looked at him steadily. "Are you in any legal difficulty?" "No," he said, immediately and with certainty. Then, slower, "Nothing of that kind." "No." "Then there is no pressing danger in remaining here for a few more days," she said. "The people on this estate who know you are here will say nothing. I am confident of that." He looked at her. "You are very certain of two people you have only recently met." "I know Mrs. Penny well enough," Clara said, "and I know what I saw this morning when George walked away from that chimney smoke. That is sufficient." He was quiet again. The fire made its small, regular sounds. Outside the cottage window, the morning light had strengthened to the pale, clear brightness of a cold December day. "I was not always like this," he said. He said it without preamble, in the middle of the silence, as though it were a continuation of something they had already been discussing, rather than something new. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. You said that yesterday as well. It was true yesterday, she said. How do you know? The coat, she said simply. The way you eat. The way you speak. The way you held yourself when I first saw you on the bench. Not the way a person holds themselves who has always been in difficulty. The way a person holds themselves who remembers not being in difficulty and cannot entirely accept that the memory belongs to the same life they are currently in. He looked at her for a long moment. She had said it plainly, without decoration, which was how she said most things, and she was not certain he would appreciate it. Some people did not want to be seen that clearly. They preferred the kindness of a polite distance. But he nodded, just once. I had a business partner, he said after a while, for 23 years. His name was Oliver Brennan. He did not continue immediately. He turned his teacup in his hands and looked at the fire. 23 years is a long time to know a man, Clara said. Yes, Edward said. Long enough to trust him. Long enough to stop watching him carefully. He paused. I have learned, at considerable cost, that trusting a person completely and knowing them completely are not the same thing, and that the first is possible in the near absence of the second. He fell quiet again. Clara did not push. She sat in the chair by the stove and looked at the fire with him, because sometimes the thing that made it possible for a person to keep speaking was simply the company of someone else who was not waiting to respond. Within the partnership, without my full knowledge, not criminal commitments, nothing dishonest in the legal sense, but reckless ones, made in his name, which was as good as my name, because we had built something together over 23 years, and our names were in everything we did together. He stopped. When it came apart publicly. There were newspaper accounts. There were associations with other men's failures that were difficult to disconnect from our own names. He looked at his hands. I have a son, he said. He said it simply, as though he were stating a fact of geography, but Clara could hear, underneath the simplicity, the weight of what those 4 words were carrying. She did not respond immediately. She let them settle. He had worked, Edward continued, for many years at building something of real consequence and real quality. He had been careful in a way that I had not been careful enough, and his carefulness had produced results that were, by any honest measure, impressive. He is, a man of considerable ability. He paused. The newspaper stories about the business, about Oliver, and about me, appeared at a moment when my son was on the verge of an arrangement that was very important to him. The association was damaging. Did the arrangement fall apart? Clara asked. It nearly did, Edward said. He managed it. He is a man who manages things effectively. Another pause. But the damage to his opinion of me did not recover in the same way that the business arrangement recovered. Clara looked at the fire. He asked me to be quiet about my connection to him, Edward said. He said it was temporary, that things would settle, that he only needed time. He stopped. The request to be quiet became, over several months, a request to be less present, and then, a request to be absent. He looked at the floor. I was not required to agree, but I agreed. Clara said, Why? He was quiet for a long time. Because my wife would have known what to do, he said. Cecilia would have found the right path through it. Not the comfortable one, but the true one. And she was gone by then, and I did not trust my own judgment enough to do it without her. There it was, Clara thought. There was the other thing that was inside all the rest of it. Not just the business, and the son, and the walking. The loss of the one person who might have helped him navigate all of it. She did not try to fix this, or address it. She sat with it alongside him for a few minutes, the way you sit with something that is simply heavy, without suggesting it should be lighter. How long? She asked, quietly. Since I have been moving? He considered. 14 months. Since she died, 4 years. She let both facts sit in their own spaces, because they were different kinds of weight, and deserved to be treated as different. When she left at 6, he was quieter than he had been that morning, not worse, not the bad kind of quiet, the closed-down quiet of the bench, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been put down, a tired quiet, a quiet that had room in it. She walked back to the house, thinking about a man who had walked for 14 months, because there was no one left whose judgment he trusted enough to ask for help navigating the thing he was walking away from. She thought about that for a long time. The next morning, she found him at the table, writing. He had found a scrap of paper somewhere, the back of a seed catalog, she thought, that George sometimes kept in the cottage on a shelf, and he had borrowed the small pencil from the window ledge, and he was writing something carefully, slowly, with the deliberate concentration of someone who does not have many words available and wants to place them properly. He looked up when she knocked and came in. He did not put the paper away, but he turned it face down on the table in a way that was not aggressive but was clear. Clara set the breakfast on the table beside the face-down paper without looking at it.
"How is the cough?"
she asked. He had developed a slight cough the previous evening, the cold settling into his chest after the weeks of outdoor exposure, and she had been thinking about it on the walk over. "Manageable," he said. She looked at him. "It is manageable," he said again, meeting her eyes with an expression of mild and polite obstinacy. She made a tea from the dried thyme she had brought in a small packet from the kitchen herb shelf, sweetened with the last of the honey from the small jar Mrs. Penny had pressed into her hands that morning without explanation, and she put it in front of him. He looked at the cup, he looked at her. He picked it up and drank it. "You didn't ask about the paper," he said. "No," Clara said. A pause. "Are you not curious?" "I am very curious," Clara said. "But it is your paper and your pencil and your words. If you want me to know what is on it, you'll tell me." He looked at her across the table. "You are a very unusual woman, Miss Whitmore." "So I have occasionally been told," Clara said, "usually by people who mean it as a criticism." "I do not mean it as a criticism," he said. "I know," she said. After a moment, he picked up the paper and turned it over and looked at it. "It is a letter," he said. "I was attempting to write a letter." He paused. "I am not yet sure to whom." Clara looked at the paper in his hands. She could see a few lines of careful, controlled handwriting, small, precise letters, the hand of someone who had signed many documents and knew the weight of written words. "You don't have to decide right now," she said. "No," he agreed. He folded the paper in half, and then half again, and placed it in the breast pocket of the flannel shirt. "No, not right now." Clara poured herself a cup of the thyme tea as well, partly because she was cold from the walk, and partly because she had learned that the offer of sharing food or drink was one of the most reliable ways of staying in a room without the weight of the staying becoming visible. They drank their tea. Outside the cottage window, the morning was bright and mercilessly cold, the kind of cold that was beautiful to look at from a warm room, and brutal in any other context. The frost on the kitchen garden was unbroken, the grass each individual blade sheeted in white. 3 crows were picking about near the bare herb beds with the focused, proprietary air of birds who have decided a territory belongs to them. "Tell me about where you grew up," Edward said, unexpectedly. Clara looked at him. "If you don't mind," he added. "I have been asking you to hear about me. It seems ungenerous to offer nothing in return." "I grew up in Somerset," Clara said. "My father was a clerk at a solicitor's office. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable, until I was 12. And then the comfort contracted quite quickly when my father's health failed." She said it plainly, because it was simply the facts, and she had long since stopped finding the facts distressing. "He died when I was 14. I went to live with my aunt in Devonshire, who was not unkind, but was not warm, and who believed strongly that a girl without money was best served by becoming as useful as possible, as quickly as possible." "So you became a governess," Edward said. "Eventually," Clara said. "I taught myself what I needed to know first. I borrowed books. I sat at the edges of lessons I was never meant to be in. I became very good at learning things that no one intended to teach me." He looked at her with the careful attentiveness he brought to most things. "You are not angry about it," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I was," Clara said, "for a while. But anger at a fact uses up a great deal of energy that could be used for something more productive." She looked at the fire, and the facts, looked at honestly, gave me something. A very particular kind of independence. When you have had to make your own way through most things, you discover that you are capable of making your own way through most things. That is not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it is not nothing." Outside, the crows had moved on. The frost was beginning, very gradually, to soften where the morning light reached it directly. Clara looked at the kitchen garden, and thought about independence, and what it cost, and what it gave. And she thought about a man who had had everything given to him, and then had it taken away, and had not, in 14 months, found out yet what it might be possible to build with the taking away. That, she thought, was a thing that might still be built, if he could find someone to help him start. She did not say this. It was too large to say yet. She poured more tea and handed it across the table, and he took it, and they sat in the warm, simple company of the morning, without needing it to be anything more than what it was. The fever arrived on Friday night without warning, the way fevers do when they have been building quietly beneath a surface of apparent recovery. Clara arrived at the cottage on Saturday morning to find the fire burned down to nothing and the door to the stove hanging open at an angle that told her no one had tended it in hours. The room was cold, not as cold as the lane outside, but cold enough that she could see her breath. She set her bag down and looked around, and then she looked at the cot, and the cot was empty, the blanket pushed to one side. She found Edward on the floor beside the cot. He was conscious. She could see that immediately. His eyes were open and tracking her as she crossed the room in 3 fast steps and crouched beside him. But his face was wrong. Too much color, the wrong kind, and too much heat coming off him, even before she pressed her fingers to his brow. The skin there was burning. "How long have you been on the floor?" she asked. He looked up at her with the dark eyes, which were glassy at the edges with the fever, but still focused. "Since approximately 2 o'clock, he said. His voice was slightly rough with it, but he was attempting the same precise, measured delivery as always, which under the circumstances struck her as both admirable and somewhat exhausting. "Why did you not call out?" she asked. "There was no one to call," he said. He paused. "And I did not want to be a further inconvenience." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Getting up from the floor without assistance in your current state would be considerably more inconvenient than calling out," she said. "Come, I am going to help you up." She was stronger than she looked and her grip was sure, and she got him from the floor to the cot with efficiency and without unnecessary drama. She settled him against the wall with the blanket around him, and immediately rebuilt the fire, laid it carefully, got it lit on the second match, adjusted the vents to draw the heat up fast. Then she went to work. She had managed fevers before. Her father's, in the last difficult weeks of his life, when the money was gone, and there was no one else to do it, and she had been 14 years old, and alone, in the management of something far too large for a 14-year-old, and she had managed it, by doing each small thing in turn, and not looking at the whole of it, because the whole of it would have undone her. She had managed 3 fevers in the Hargrove children over 3 years, each one different, each one requiring slightly different handling. She knew the shape of a fever, how it moved, when it was dangerous and when it was not. This one, she assessed, was not dangerous yet, but it was not mild either, and it needed steady attention through the day. She sent word to the house, through the small chalkboard she used on the cottage exterior wall, for communication with Mrs. Penny. A simple system she had devised in the 2nd week. A circle meant all well. A line meant bring extra food. A question mark meant come if you can. She drew a question mark, then she went back inside, and stayed. She kept the fire steady. She changed the cloth on his brow every 20 minutes with cool water from the flask. She made sure he drank when he was awake enough to drink. She sat in the chair beside the cot when he was sleeping, and she read the Marcus Aurelius, which he had left on the table, and when he was awake enough to talk, she talked with him about whatever was at the surface. He was not, for most of the morning, precisely asleep. He was in the in-between place that fevers create, a state that was neither sleep nor full waking, but a kind of suspended room, where normal defenses were lowered, and the mind moved according to its own logic rather than the logic of the waking self. In this state, he talked. Not to her, not quite. The words were directed inward, or directed to someone who was not in the room, someone he was reaching toward, or responding to, in the private geography of the fever. "The documents," he said, at one point. He was not looking at anything. His eyes were half open, and directed at the ceiling. "Oliver, I should have read the documents more carefully. You told me not to worry about the documents." Clara kept her face neutral, and changed the cloth and said nothing. Later, "That was not what I intended. It was never what I intended. You must believe that." A pause, in which whoever he was speaking to apparently said something he was not happy with. "William, will you please listen to me?" The name landed in the room, and Clara looked at him carefully without changing her expression. Later still, with a clarity that was startling, given the fog of the rest of it, he sat partly up and looked directly at the far wall. She would have known. Cecilia always knew exactly what to do, and I never told her often enough that I understood that. I thought there would be more time to tell her. His voice broke very slightly on the last 4 words, and then he lay back and was quiet for a long time. Clara sat beside him and looked at the fire and kept her own counsel. By mid-afternoon, the fever was at its peak. Mrs. Penny appeared at the cottage door at 2 o'clock, with a pot of clear broth and a look on her face that said she had looked at the question mark and decided that bringing extra food was insufficient, and she was going to come herself, regardless of anyone's opinion about it. She surveyed the situation with the thoroughness of a woman who had nursed 3 of her own children through illness and knew what she was looking at. She handed Clara the broth and a bundle of clean cloths and a small bottle of the willow bark tincture she kept in the kitchen for just such purposes, and she said, "The children are fine. Agnes is with them. Do what needs doing," and she left. Clara used the willow bark tincture, 6 drops in the broth, as the label instructed, the way she had learned from Mrs. Penny's explanation of it on a previous occasion, and she got Edward to take it in small sips over the course of an hour, which required patience and a firmness that did not allow for argument, and the occasional gentle instruction of the kind that admitted no variation. The fever broke at 4:30. She knew it was breaking by the gradual softening of the heat and the change in his breathing, the tight, labored quality dissolving into something more natural, more like actual sleep. By 5 o'clock he was sleeping properly. By 6, when she went to the door and looked out at the evening, she felt the particular, quiet exhaustion of having managed something that required sustained attention, and managed it well. She went back to the house. In the kitchen, Mrs. Penny put the kettle on without being asked, and set a cup of strong tea and a piece of cold pie in front of Clara at the kitchen table, and sat down across from her, which she had done once before, in the way of a woman who understood that some situations were best not managed in isolation. They drank their tea. "His color?" Mrs. Penny asked. "Better," Clara said. "The fever's broken. He's sleeping." "He's thin," Mrs. Penny said. "I noticed when I was there. He needs more than broth." "He is improving," Clara said. "Give him until tomorrow." Mrs. Penny nodded. She looked at her tea. "He speaks well," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "I heard him, through the wall. Not the words, just the voice." A pause. "That is an educated man, Miss Whitmore." "Yes," Clara said. Mrs. Penny did not ask anything further. She poured them each more tea. They sat with it. Edward slept through the night, and was sitting up and fully coherent when Clara arrived on Sunday morning. The fever had not returned. He was weak. She could see it in the way he moved, more carefully than before, husbanding his energy, but his eyes were clear, and his voice was steady, and when she brought him the solid breakfast Mrs. Penny had prepared, he ate it with an appetite she hadn't seen from him before. She let him eat without conversation. When he had finished, she took the empty bowl and set it aside. He looked at the table for a moment, and then at her. "I will tell you the rest of it," he said, "if you want to hear it." "Only if you want to tell it," Clara said. "I think I do," he said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing something. "I think it needs to be said out loud, in a room, to another person. I have been carrying it entirely inside my own head for 14 months, and it has not improved with the carrying." Clara settled in her chair. He told her about his family first. The Ashford name, the weight of it in the county, the 200 years of it sitting on the estate that bore it. The expectations that came with that name, not stated explicitly, not in his experience, but present in every room he had ever walked into as a child, sitting in every teacher's expression and every neighbor's greeting. The knowledge, absorbed early and completely, that there were things the name permitted and things it did not, and that the boundary between them was kept by each generation's management of their own conduct. He had been a careful man, he said. For 40 years of his adult life, he had been a careful man. He had managed the estate well. He had maintained the relationships that mattered, built the ones that needed building, made the decisions that served the long view rather than the immediate one. His wife Cecilia had been his partner in all of it, not in the formal sense, not in the rooms where documents were signed and decisions officially ratified, but in every room before and after those rooms, where the real thinking was done. She had been, he said, The clearest mind he had ever encountered in a life spent among people who were paid to have clear minds. When Oliver Brennan had come to him 18 years ago with the proposal for a commercial partnership, Cecilia had been the one to raise the question that turned out to matter. Not the business question, not the question about the financial structure or the market position, which they had examined thoroughly and found sound. The other question, the one about the man himself. She asked me, Edward said, whether I would trust Oliver Brennan with something I could not afford to lose. Not money, something else. Whether, if I gave him a thing of real importance, I believed with certainty that he would protect it with the same care I would. He paused. He looked at his hands. I said yes, he said. I said yes without hesitating. Because I liked Oliver. Because he was charming and clever and good company, and in 23 years I had never had cause to revise that opinion. He paused. Cecilia said nothing more. But I have thought about that question, and my answer to it, very often since. The commercial venture had gone well for 12 years. Oliver managed his part of it, the relationship side, the communications, the negotiations with their various partners, with the energy and intelligence that had made him such a compelling choice. Edward managed his side, the financial structures, the long-term agreements, the oversight, with the patience and precision that were his particular strengths. They complemented each other, everyone said so, and everyone was right. The shipping contract had been Oliver's arrangement, a large and lucrative contract with a company that was, at the time, considered a sound investment. Oliver had managed the early negotiations without Edward's detailed involvement, which was within the terms of how they worked. Edward had been occupied with a situation at the estate, Cecilia's health, which had begun its quiet decline during those months. And Oliver had been, as Oliver always had been, entirely competent and entirely trustworthy. Or so it had seemed. What he did not tell me, Edward said, was that he had made commitments to the shipping company that extended beyond what the contract specified, commitments that were his personal word, rather than the partnership's formal agreement. When the shipping company encountered its own difficulties and began calling in those commitments, they used Oliver's word as the basis for claims that exceeded anything the formal contract would have supported. The losses were substantial. More important, in terms of what happened afterward, was that the whole thing had unfolded publicly. 3 county newspapers had carried the story. The name Brennan had been in every account, and the name Ashford beside it, because the partnership had been known as Brennan and Ashford for 18 years. His son, and here Edward's voice did something that Clara registered without drawing attention to, had built, by this time, the Ashford estate into something considerably more prosperous and well-regarded than it had been when he inherited it. William had done this through years of careful, unglamorous work, renegotiating old leases, modernizing the estate's agricultural operations, developing commercial relationships with investors who valued efficiency and reliability. He had been, by every account, impressively successful. And at the precise moment that the newspaper stories about Brennan and Ashford appeared, William had been in the final stages of a significant investment arrangement that would have secured the estate's financial position for another generation. The investors had hesitated. Not for long, the arrangement had eventually been concluded, because William had handled it with the same controlled efficiency he brought to everything. But in the weeks of the hesitation, he had spoken to his father. He had come in person. He had been very composed, Edward said. He was always very composed. He had sat in the chair in the estate library, the same chair he had sat in as a boy when he was brought there for conversations about matters that required seriousness. And he had looked at his father, and he had spoken with precision. He did not blame him, William had said. He understood that these things happen. He understood that Oliver Brennan had been a man of apparent integrity for many years, and that trust, once established over such a period, was not easy to qualify. He did not blame his father. But he was asking his father to be quiet about their connection, for a time, while things settled and the investor's memory of the newspaper stories faded, just for a time. He did not ask cruelly, Edward said. He was looking at the fire. He did not ask with anger or with contempt. He asked with the very controlled, very precise composure that has been his way since he was a boy, and which makes it extremely difficult to know what is underneath it. He paused for a long time. Cecilia could always read him, he said. She was the only one who could, really. She knew when the composure was genuine and when it was armor. She would have known That day in the library, whether he was asking from practical necessity or from something deeper, she would have known what was actually underneath the composure. He looked at his hands, but she was gone. She had been gone for 6 months by then, and I sat in the library and I looked at my son asking me to be quiet, and I could not read him the way she could have, and I agreed because I did not know what else to agree to. The request had been renewed several months later, quieter, briefer, and then, in the spring of the following year, it had become something different, a request, delivered through a letter from William's secretary, that Edward make arrangements to live in the county seat rather than near the estate, as the estate was involved in ongoing negotiations that would benefit from simplicity of connection. And Edward had gone. I did not fight it, he said. I want to be clear about that. I chose to go. He looked at Clara directly. I chose to go because I did not trust my own judgment after Cecilia died, and because whatever I might have felt about the request, I could not be certain that William was wrong to make it. I had caused real damage, not intentionally, but the intentions of a man who has caused damage are not the primary fact of the situation. Clara sat with everything he had said. She sat with it carefully, and at length, because it deserved that. You said he would come, she said, finally. When you told me you were walking to the north, you stopped mid-sentence, and you said there was no destination. What were you going to say? He looked at her, a long look. I was going to say I was walking toward finding out whether I could bring myself to ask him for something, he said. And then I stopped, because I realized I still did not know whether I could. Clara looked at the fire. You sat down on that bench instead, she said. Yes, he said. In the end, the bench was as far as I got. She thought about that for the rest of the day, long after she had left the cottage and gone back to the house and supervised the children's afternoon activities, and eaten her supper and gone to bed. She thought about a man who had walked for 14 months toward a question, and stopped at a bench before he could ask it. She thought about whether someone else might ask it for him. She did not act on that thought, not yet. But she stored it carefully in the place where she kept things that needed more time, and she turned it over slowly, and she waited for it to become clear. Dorothy Fielding had a grip, like a woman who had spent her life making sure people did not leave a conversation before she was ready for them to. Clara felt it on her arm before she turned around, a firm, proprietary clasp just above the elbow. She had been at Henry Croft's counter selecting the week's dry goods, flour, tea, a pot of mustard, the particular dried herbs that Mrs. Penny preferred from no other supplier in the county, and she had been moving efficiently through the task, because market morning was not a morning she had in abundance, and she had turned from the shelf of spices when the hand found her. You're the Hargrove governess, aren't you? Said Dorothy Fielding. It was not a question, and not really meant to be. I am, Clara said. Dorothy Fielding pulled her slightly sideways, away from the counter, and the two women examining a bolt of cloth near the window, toward the narrow space between the spice shelf and the door to the shop's back room. She had the air of someone who was about to impart something of great significance, and wished to be sure of the proper stage for it. She was a woman of approximately 50, with sharp eyes and a good wool coat, and the general bearing of someone who had decided quite some time ago that she was the most reliably informed person in the vicinity, and had organized her life around the maintenance of that position. Have you heard about the Ashford situation? She said, lowering her voice to the exact pitch that ensured everyone in the shop could still hear it, while maintaining the pleasure of the confidential delivery. Clara kept her face in its ordinary arrangement. I have heard the name, she said. Which situation are you referring to? Dorothy Fielding adjusted the handle of her basket. The father, she said. The old man, the Duke's father. She paused significantly, the pause of a woman who knew she was about to produce an effect, and was giving herself the pleasure of the moment before it. He's gone missing. Clara looked at her. Missing for a week or more now, Dorothy continued, satisfied that she had the full attention. The family sent someone to look for him, a man with a notebook, going house to house along all the surrounding lanes. Did he come to the Hargrove estate? A man did come to the gate, Clara said, in the careful voice she used when being accurate required precision. He asked about the lane. We were not able to help him. Dorothy accepted this with a small, thoughtful nod, as though filing it alongside other information she had already collected. Well, she said, between you and me, the word from Agnes Trent, whose cousin works in the kitchens at Ashford Hall, so she would know. is that they are not looking very energetically. Or rather, the secretary is looking energetically, because that is what the secretary is paid to do. But the Duke himself, she paused. There is some feeling that the Duke is not, well, that he is not grieving the absence. They have had difficulties, Clara said. She said it carefully, as a statement of something already publicly known, rather than as personal knowledge. Difficulties, Dorothy said, with the satisfied expression of someone who finds the word insufficient, but appreciates the opening it offers. Well, yes. That business with the shipping company 2 years ago. It was in 3 newspapers. Did you see it? The Brennan and Ashford firm, the losses with the cargo company. Well, the name Ashford was attached to it, and the Duke was in the middle of some very important arrangement with London investors at the time, and they nearly pulled out entirely. Very nearly. The Duke managed it, because the Duke manages everything. But I was told by someone who was at a dinner with him that week, he was not himself in the eyes. You know what I mean? A man who is usually very composed and settled and shows nothing, and there was something showing. People noticed. And the father? Clara said. She said it with the mildness of someone asking a follow-up question in an ordinary conversation. Gone, Dorothy said. Wandering, from what can be told. Agnes Trent's cousin said the old man left the county seat. That was where he had been living, separately from the hall, for some months, and hasn't been back. No address, no letter, nothing. Just gone. She shook her head. Can you imagine? A man whose family has held Ashford Hall for 200 years, walking the county lanes with no money and no address. She looked at Clara with large, thoughtful eyes. Though I suppose, she added, when a son asks a father to disappear, the father has rather fewer options than one might think. She said this without any particular drama, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone making a logical observation rather than a judgment, which was somehow worse. It sat in the air between them. Clara said, Yes, I suppose that is true. She finished her shopping at a pace that was unhurried enough not to confirm anything, said her goodbyes to Henry Croft and to Dorothy Fielding, who could have continued for another hour given the opportunity, and walked back to the Hargrove estate through the cold morning air, with a head full of things that were rearranging themselves around each other. She had known. She acknowledged this to herself on the walk home, cleanly and without fuss, because she had known for several days and had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would require her to make a decision about it, and she had not yet been ready to make the decision. She was ready now. The things she knew were these. Edward was Edward Ashford. His son was the Duke of Ashford. William, the man Dorothy Fielding had described as someone who managed everything and showed nothing, and who had at some recent dinner shown something in his eyes that the people at the table had noticed. His wife Cecilia had died 4 years ago. The business disaster involving Oliver Brennan had been very publicly recorded in 3 county newspapers. Edward had been living at the county seat, separately from the hall, for some months, which meant the request to be absent had preceded the 14 months of walking. The man with the notebook had been sent, probably by Frederick Barrow or on Barrow's instructions, to locate an old man who had become a problem by going missing from wherever he had been assigned to be missing in a less visible way. And Edward was in a cottage on the south edge of the Hargrove estate, with a cut on his brow that was almost fully healed, and a cough that was improving, and a copy of Marcus Aurelius that she had placed on a table, and which he had read almost entirely through. Clara walked through the Hargrove gate and across the grounds to the cottage at her usual pace. She knocked twice. She went in. He was in the chair by the fire, the book closed on his knee, looking at the window. He turned when she came in, and she looked at him, and she saw him with the different clarity that the morning had given her. She saw a man of perhaps 72 years, taller than the chair made him look, with a quality of presence that had not entirely left him, despite everything the past 14 months had done to it. She saw the cheekbones that were distinct in the way of faces that had been well maintained and were now more austere from the weeks of outdoor living and insufficient food. She saw the hands, which were the hands of a man who had spent his life in offices and libraries rather than in fields, long-fingered and articulate, a little rough now from the cold. She saw the way he arranged himself even in a cottage chair, with an unconscious formality that came from so many years of arranging himself formally in important rooms that the arrangement had become invisible to him. She saw the Duke's father, She had been seeing him for some days now, but she had not let herself see him completely, and now she did. He looked back at her, and in his eyes she saw, very briefly, that he saw that she was looking at him differently. Not with alarm, not with any sharp change of expression. Just a very slight settling, as though he had been waiting for this moment and was now in it. Clara sat on the edge of the cot. She folded her hands in her lap. "I went to the village market this morning," she said. "Yes," he said, just that one word. "A woman there," Clara said, "was very informative about the Ashford family, about the father of the Duke of Ashford, specifically, about certain business difficulties 2 years ago, and about a man who has been walking the county lanes for some time without a fixed address." He was looking at her steadily. "You are Edward Ashford," she said. It was not a question. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. "Yes," he said. Clara nodded. She sat with this for a moment. "Does it change anything?" he asked. Not with defensiveness. He was not, she had learned, a man given to defensive questions. With the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to know the answer to a real question. Clara thought about it with the proper seriousness it required, because it was a question that deserved proper consideration, and not a reflexive reassurance. "It changes what I understand," she said finally. "It does not change what I am doing." He looked at her for a long time. The fire made its sounds. Outside the cottage window, a robin had appeared in the kitchen garden, and was picking among the frozen herb beds with intense, businesslike attention. "The Duke of Ashford is your son," Clara said. "William." "Yes," Edward said. "He does not know where you are." "No." He paused. "I believe his secretary is attempting to locate me, in a general way. But no, William does not know. And if he did know—" Edward was quiet for a moment. He would respond appropriately, he said, and the word appropriately landed in the room, with a weight that was very specific and not comfortable. Clara looked at the robin in the garden. It had found something of interest in the dead lavender bush, and was proceeding with it purposefully. "The woman in the village," she said that when your son asks a father to disappear, the father has fewer options than one might think. He was very quiet. "She was not being unkind," Clara said. "She was being accurate." "I know," Edward said. He looked at the fire. "I know." They sat together in the warmth of the small room for a few minutes. The fire settled. The robin finished with the lavender bush and moved on. "What I said to you on the second morning," Clara said, "about not asking what you were doing on the bench, because the answer would not change what I was doing. That is still true. I want you to understand that." He looked at her. "You could be the king's father," she said, "and you were on a bench in November with blood in your hair, and my response would have been the same. It was not about who you were. It was about what was in front of me." He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said. That is the part I find most difficult to understand, not in a doubting way, but in the way of encountering something you have been trying to remember existed, and finding it again, and not being entirely certain what to do with the fact of it." Clara stood. She picked up his empty cup and poured more tea from the flask. "You should know," she said, handing it back, "that in the village they are saying the Duke of Ashford is a man who manages everything very effectively and shows nothing, and that the nothing slipped, briefly, at a dinner after the business difficulties, and people noticed." She said it simply, as information, not as argument. She set it down between them, the way she set down everything, without pressure, without instruction, available to be picked up or left as he chose. He received it in the same way. He looked at the cup of tea in his hands. He was not always like that, he said. He learned it. He was, as a boy, a person who felt things very fully. A pause. "I sometimes wonder whether the composure is something he built, because the world required it of him, or because the world was not safe enough for the other version." He looked at the tea. "I wonder whether I contributed to the construction of it." Clara said, "That is a question only he can answer." "Yes," Edward said quietly. I know that." She left the cottage at 5:30. She walked back to the house through the gathering dark, the frost already forming again on the grass, the kitchen windows warm and yellow ahead of her. She had a great deal to think about, and she thought about it with her usual efficiency and without wasted feeling. She thought about what she had now understood, and what it required of her. Not what it made her feel. That was secondary to what she intended to do, but what it required. That was the relevant question. By the time she reached the kitchen door, she had an answer to it. She was not yet certain she would act on the answer, but she had it. She went inside. She did not sleep easily that night. This was unusual for her. She was, as a general rule, someone who could sleep in difficult circumstances, because she had learned early that the nights spent awake worrying were never the ones that resolved anything, and she had trained herself over many years to put things away at bedtime with the understanding that they would still be there in the morning and would be better addressed with rest behind her. But tonight she lay awake with the weight of what she now fully understood. Edward Ashford was, in this county, and in every county where the name carried weight, not simply an old man with a difficult history. He was a man from a family that had existed in this landscape for 200 years. His son was the Duke of Ashford, which meant that the social machinery surrounding this situation, the implication of the Hargrove household, the involvement of Clara herself, the questions about who had known and when, and what had been done, was considerably more intricate than she had been treating it. She had been treating it as a simple human problem with a simple human solution. A man needed help. She helped him. That part was clear and had never been in question. But now she had to hold alongside that simple fact, the more complicated fact that the man was embedded in a structure of consequence and history and family obligation that was very much larger than the cottage at the south edge of the Hargrove property. She lay in the dark and thought about the Duke. She thought about what Dorothy Fielding had said, a man who managed everything and showed nothing. She thought about what Edward had said, that he had not always been like that the composure was something he had built, that the world had perhaps been unsafe for the other version. She thought about what it meant to be the son of a man like Edward, accomplished, principled, clearly loving in his way, and to have that father become publicly associated with disaster, and to have to manage the fallout of the association while simultaneously managing the grief of losing your mother, and to do all of this with composure, because composure was the tool you had, the thing you had spent decades constructing, and there was no other tool available. She thought about the question of whether the son who had asked his father to be quiet and then to be absent had been asking from practical necessity or from something older and harder and less easily named. And she thought about whether it was possible that neither the son nor the father had a clear enough view of the other's interior to know what was actually true between them. She did not know the answer. She had not met the Duke. She had only the information she had, and information about people is always incomplete. But she thought that an incomplete view was not always a reason for inaction, when the cost of inaction was a man walking in winter lanes for 14 months with no address and no destination, and a bench as the furthest he had gotten. She thought about what a letter might say. Not yet. She was not writing any letter tonight. But she was beginning to understand, lying in the dark with the frost settling against the window pane, that she was going to write one eventually. The only questions were when and how. She turned over. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she went back to the cottage with the usual things, and she sat with Edward, and she did not mention anything about what she had spent the night thinking about. She sat with him, and they talked about other things, about a passage in the book that had interested him, about the kitchen garden in summer, and whether herbs grew better in full sun or partial shade, about whether it was better to have loved someone and lost them, or never to have had that particular weight at all. He said, without hesitation, that it was better to have had it. She thought about that as well. Mr. Hargrove was standing in the corridor when Clara came down for breakfast on Wednesday morning, and the expression on his face was one she had learned to recognize in 3 years of working in his household. The expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now on the edge of delivering it, but is not entirely comfortable with the delivery. He had his hands clasped behind his back, which was what he did when he was attempting the posture of someone at ease while feeling the opposite, and he was standing in the center of the corridor rather than to one side, which meant he was there deliberately and wished to intercept her rather than merely encounter her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "if you would be so kind, before breakfast." He led her into the small sitting room off the corridor and closed the door. The sitting room was used for conversations that required some degree of privacy, which in the Hargrove household were not frequent. Mr. Hargrove was not a man who enjoyed difficult conversations, and generally arranged his life to avoid them. Clara stood in the center of the room with her lesson books against her chest and waited. Mr. Hargrove turned to face her. He had the expression of a man delivering something he has determined is necessary but would have preferred not to be necessary, which is a very specific expression, and she recognized it precisely. "There is," he said, "a man in the gardener's cottage." "Yes, sir," Clara said. This was apparently not the response he had anticipated. He regrouped with the slight adjustment of a man whose rehearsed opening has been acknowledged rather than denied, and who must now proceed from a different point than expected. "He has been there," Mr. Hargrove said, "for some time." 11 days, sir." 11 days. He looked at her. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to understand that I have great respect, genuine respect, for the impulse that led you to assist a person in need. I would not wish to be the kind of employer who discourages that impulse as a general matter. It reflects well on your character." He paused, gathering himself. "However," he said, "I must be direct with you. I have reason to believe, from information that has reached me through various channels in the last 2 days, that the man in the cottage may be connected to the Ashford family. To the Duke of Ashford." He looked at her steadily. "You are aware, I am sure, of what the name Ashford means in this county. The Duke is a man of very significant standing, and the affairs of his family are not something I am equipped to involve this household in. The situation between the Duke and his father is a private matter of great sensitivity, and any involvement by this estate in that situation, however well-intentioned, could produce consequences that I have no capacity to manage." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has said what he needed to say, and is now waiting to see whether it has landed. Clara held the lesson books against her chest. She kept her face in its ordinary arrangement, which required some effort this morning, because she had a number of things she might have said, and was selecting carefully among them. "I understand, Mr. Hargrove," she said. He nodded, something in his posture releasing slightly. He had expected, she thought, more resistance. "I must ask," he said, "that arrangements be made for the man to leave by Saturday. I recognize that is a short time frame, and I recognize that his situation is, that he has been unwell, from what I understand, and that the circumstances are not simple. But Saturday. I am sorry to be firm about this, Miss Whitmore. I am not naturally a firm man in these matters, but the situation requires it." He paused again. She could see him deciding whether to add the final thing, and then deciding he must. "If it is not possible to make those arrangements," he said carefully, "then I would be required to ask you to find another position. I would provide an excellent letter of reference, but I could not in good conscience continue the current situation beyond Saturday." He looked at her with something that was almost apology. She could see that it cost him something, this conversation, and she did not think he was a bad man for the cost or for the message. He was a careful man who lived inside the boundaries of what his life could reasonably hold, and she was placing something outside those boundaries, and he was, not unreasonably, saying so. "I will manage the situation, Mr. Hargrove," she said, "by Saturday." He nodded with the relief of a man whose responsibility is discharged. He opened the sitting room door, and they both went to breakfast, as though the conversation had not occurred, which was the procedure in this kind of household, and Clara was practiced in it. She spent the morning teaching and the early afternoon walking the children, without giving any outward indication that anything was other than ordinary, because the children did not need her difficulty, and she was perfectly capable of carrying it herself until the appropriate time for it. She went to the cottage at 4 o'clock. Edward was sitting by the fire with the book, as he always was. He looked up when she came in, and registered something in her expression that she had not, apparently, entirely managed to conceal. "Something has happened," he said. She sat in the chair and told him plainly what Mr. Hargrove had said, using the same words he had used because there was no value in softening words that were already as careful as they needed to be. Edward listened without interrupting. He sat perfectly still while she spoke, the way he sat when something required his full attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I have put you in a very difficult position," he said. "You did not ask to fall on the ice," Clara said. "Nevertheless." He looked at the fire. "The position you are in is a consequence of a decision you made on my behalf, and the decision was generous, and I should not have allowed it to create a difficulty for you. You were not in a state to make decisions for yourself on that morning, Clara said. I made the decision, and I am not asking to be absolved of its consequences. He looked at her with the dark, steady eyes. You are the most uncompromising person I have met in a long time, he said. I am practical, Clara said. There is still a distinction. The practical question is what happens by Saturday. She looked at him directly. I have been turning over the available options. There are 2 charitable establishments in the county that maintain decent accommodation for elderly men of reduced means. I have heard from good sources that they are neither cruel nor neglectful. If you were willing, I will not go to a charitable institution, Edward said, not with anger, not with anything that could be called a raised voice, but with a completeness that allowed for no variation. No, Clara said, I thought not. They sat with the remaining options, which were limited. There is the question of your son, Clara said. She said it without preamble, because she had been thinking about how to approach it for 4 hours, and had concluded that the only approach that did not waste time was the direct one. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. You said, when we first spoke about him, that he would come, if he knew where you were, that he would come, because it would be the correct thing to do. Clara paused. What would it mean for him to come? Not the logistics of it. What would it mean? Edward turned the book over in his hands without opening it. It would mean, he said slowly, that the thing I have been walking away from for 14 months is now a thing I must walk back toward. He paused, and that I must do it before I have decided whether I am ready to. Are you ever going to be ready? Clara asked. He was quiet. Edward, she said, gently but directly, are you ever going to be ready on your own? The fire made its sounds. Outside, the afternoon had turned dark, the short winter days giving up their light early and completely. No, he said at last, probably not. Then Saturday is simply the occasion, Clara said. Rather than a crisis, it requires the same action, but it removes the question of timing from you. He looked at her for a long time. You make it sound very simple, he said. It is not simple, Clara said. I know it is not simple. I am not suggesting it is simple. I am suggesting that simple and necessary are not the same thing, and that necessary things sometimes have to be done before they feel possible. He looked at the fire. My son, he said, is a man of duty. He would come. But there is a difference between coming because it is the dutiful thing and coming because one genuinely. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I have spent 14 months not knowing whether my son wishes me to exist. Clara heard the full weight of that sentence. She sat with it for a moment. Then, she said, quietly, you need the answer to that question more than you need anything else, and you cannot get the answer without being in the same room with him. He did not respond immediately. He looked at the fire with the expression of a man examining something true from a direction he has been avoiding. She would have told me the same thing, he said. Cecilia. Good, Clara said. Then 2 of us agree with each other, and you are the only dissenting vote. He looked at her, and the thing that was almost a smile moved across his face. You would have argued with her, I think, he said. She would have enjoyed you enormously. I would have enjoyed meeting her, Clara said, and she meant it. They sat together in the small warmth of the cottage for a little while longer. Outside, the frost was coming down again on the grounds, the familiar pattern of the winter evening hardening the grass and the gravel to a white and glittering stillness. You are going to write to him, Edward said. It was not a question. Clara looked at him. You have already decided to, he said. I can see it. You have that particular expression you have when you have made a decision, and are now managing the execution of it rather than the decision itself. Clara was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, I am going to write to him. He looked at the fire. You are not going to tell me. Not yet, she said. Not because I was hiding it from you, but because once I tell you, you will spend every day until his response arrives, either hoping for something particular or bracing against the hope, and neither of those is good for a cough that is still recovering. He was quiet for a very long time. I find that I am not in a position to argue with that, he said at last. No, Clara said, you are not. She got up and put her coat on and collected the empty things from the table and the flask from the floor by the stove. She stopped at the door. I am going to be honest with you about the letter, she said. I cannot promise what his response will be. I cannot promise that he will come quickly, or that when he comes, that it will be what you want it to be. I can only promise that a son who does not know where his father is has not had the opportunity to make the choice about whether to come. A letter gives him that opportunity. He looked at her from the chair by the fire. Yes, he said, you are right. I know, she said. I usually am, about the things worth being right about. She went out into the cold dark and pulled the cottage door behind her and stood for a moment on the path, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing the cold air and letting the weight of the last hour settle in around her. Then she walked back to the house. She had a letter to write. She went to her room after supper and sat at her desk and did not immediately write anything. She sat with the blank page in front of her and the candle lit and her hands folded on the desk, and she thought, carefully and at length, about everything this letter needed to accomplish and everything it needed to avoid. It needed, first, to reach the right person. Not Frederick Barrow, who was the secretary and who would, she suspected, be very efficient and very brisk and very focused on the management of the situation as a logistical problem. The Duke himself. She would address it directly to him, care of Ashford Hall, and she would write his title on the envelope in the clear, confident hand she used when she needed to communicate without uncertainty. It needed, second, to convey the essential facts without editorializing. She was not the Duke's advisor. She did not know him. She had no standing to tell him what to feel or what to do. She knew only what had happened. A man had been found. He had been helped. He was here. And those facts, delivered clearly, were sufficient for a person of intelligence to understand what they implied. It needed, third, to be written in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. Not by being dramatic. Drama would undermine it. By being precise and unadorned and entirely without sentiment, because sentiment would give a man who lived behind composure a very easy handle to grip and keep at arm's length. She picked up the pen. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too long and explained too much, and had, reading it back, a quality of justification that she recognized as the voice of someone who was not sure they had the right to do what they were doing and was filling the space with reasons. She set it aside. The second was too short and had the quality of a telegram, a set of facts delivered without any context for why those facts were being offered to this particular person. She set that aside too. The third was what the letter needed to be. She knew it when she read it back and heard her own voice in it, the same voice she used when she had something important to say and intended to say it plainly and entirely without performance. She told the Duke that a man giving his first name as Edward had been found injured near the Hargrove estate 11 days ago, and that he had been given shelter and was recovering from an illness. She told him that the man's situation was precarious, and that the time available for his current accommodation was limited. She told him that she believed his family might wish to know of his whereabouts, given that inquiries had recently been made in the surrounding area. She offered no opinion, no history, no interpretation of the relationship between the man in the cottage and the man reading the letter. She signed it with her full name and position and the estate's address. She sealed it. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She blew out the candle and went to bed. In the morning, she posted it on her way to the cottage, before she had time to think further about it, which was the method she had found most reliable for acting on decisions she had already properly made. She did not tell Edward what she had done. She told herself she would tell him when the reply arrived, if a reply arrived. If no reply came, then she had done what she could, and there was nothing more to report, and nothing would have been served by telling him. She went to the cottage and brought the food and sat in the chair and drank her tea and talked about the things they talked about, and she looked at the man across the table and thought about what it meant to have walked for 14 months and ended up here, in a gardener's cottage, with a governess and a cup of time tea and a copy of Marcus Aurelius, and whether that bench had been the worst possible place to stop or the most precisely right one. She thought, not for the first time, that the two things were not necessarily in opposition. The waiting was harder than she had expected. Clara was not, ordinarily, a person who found waiting difficult. She was patient, in the practical sense, of someone who understood that many things moved at their own pace, and that impatience did not speed them up, but merely added discomfort to the interval. She had waded through difficult things before, through her father's illness, through the months of searching for employment after her aunt's house, through the long early weeks of each new position, when the household was still a system of unknown rules and unstated expectations, and she had to map it from scratch. She knew how to wait. But this waiting had a particular quality. It was the waiting of someone who has done something that cannot be undone and has to now live in the interval between the doing and the consequence, and she found that she was more conscious of time than she usually allowed herself to be, more aware of each day passing, and each day without a response from Ashford Hall being another day that moved them all closer to Saturday. She did not let the waiting show. She taught the children their lessons with her usual thoroughness. She managed her other duties without any visible alteration in her routines. She went to the cottage twice a day, morning and late afternoon, with the food and the fresh candle, and the occasional small extra thing, a newspaper she had found in the sitting room, a piece of the apple cake Mrs. Penny had baked on Thursday, and she sat in the chair and they talked, and she gave no indication that she was listening for anything beyond the conversation itself. Edward was improving. By Thursday he was walking short distances outside the cottage, around the yew hedge and back, in the cold morning air, with the steady pace of someone reacquainting their body with movement. His color was good. The cough had been reduced to an occasional thing, a nuisance rather than a concern. He ate everything Mrs. Penny sent, and she was sending a great deal. George had taken to checking the wood stack morning and evening, refilling it from the main supply at the stable, without being asked or acknowledging that he was doing it. Agnes had begun leaving small things at the kitchen passage door when she thought no one was watching: an extra blanket, a jar of honey, a pair of thick wool gloves that had clearly been taken from the household's general supply and would be returned without any discussion when they were no longer needed. These acts were not coordinated. They had simply accumulated around the situation, the way practical kindness tends to accumulate among people who are good at it and do not require an audience. Clara noted these things, and was grateful for them in the wordless way she received most things she was grateful for. On Thursday morning, the cough was somewhat worse, not alarming. She had learned to calibrate the difference, but noticeable enough that she made another pot of the thyme tea and sat with him while he drank it, and watched his face carefully when he thought she was looking at the fire. "You are watching me very closely this morning," he said. "I am watching your cough," she said. "The cough is fine. I know. I am checking that it remains so." He looked at her with the expression that had become familiar in the last several days, a kind of steady, clear attention, not quite amusement, something warmer than that. "You are a very difficult person to argue with," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I am." He drank his tea. They sat in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over these weeks, the kind of quiet that does not need filling, that is in fact its own kind of companionship. Clara had thought, in the first days, that an elderly man of his background and history would be uncomfortable with silence, that silence would feel like an absence of the authority and activity and social texture that had structured his life. She had been wrong. He was, it turned out, a man who was entirely at home in quiet. It was, she thought, probably one of the things that had made 14 months of wandering survivable. You could not walk the winter lanes for 14 months if silence undid you. Outside the cottage window, the Thursday morning had come on gray and flat, the sky low and without any quality of light to it, the kitchen garden dull under the overcast. There was snow in that sky, she thought, perhaps tonight. "Tell me about your father," Edward said, unexpectedly. She looked at him. "You have told me a little," he said. "I would like to hear more, if you don't mind the asking." She thought about her father for a moment, the specific person of him, which she did not bring to mind as often as she perhaps might, because she had found that keeping a careful distance from the most painful things was more functional than the alternative. "He was a quiet man," she said. "Not cold, but quiet." He thought before he spoke, which made him seem more serious than he was. He had a wonderful laugh, genuine and immediate, very different from his usual deliberateness. He read everything he could get his hands on. He believed, sincerely and without performance, that education was the closest thing to a ladder that most people would ever encounter. She paused. He was in some ways better at being a father than at being a provider, and I think he knew it, and I think it troubled him more than anything else. "Did you forgive him for it?" Edward asked. She considered this honestly. "There was nothing to forgive," she said. "He did not fail me through carelessness or selfishness. He failed me through bad luck and illness. And those are not the same thing as choices." She paused. "I do wish, sometimes, that I had told him more clearly, that I understood the difference. I do not think I did, when I had the opportunity." Edward was quiet. "You said," Clara said, "that Cecilia always knew what to do, and you never told her often enough that you understood that." "Yes," he said. "I think that is something people often discover too late," she said. "That the person they were relying on, to understand that they were valued, without being explicitly told, was also waiting to hear it explicitly." He looked at the window. "Yes," he said, "I think that is exactly right." They sat in the quiet of that understanding for a while. The letter from Ashford Hall arrived on Friday morning. Clara was in the kitchen when Agnes brought the post in, and she was holding the bread knife and looking at nothing in particular, while Mrs. Penny told her something about the week's menu, and she saw the envelope from across the room before Agnes had set it down. Heavy paper. The Ashford seal in dark wax on the back. "That one is for me," she said. She said it in the ordinary tone she used for ordinary things, and she set down the bread knife and picked up the letter and walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to her room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed. The letter was from Frederick Barrow. She had expected this. The Duke would not write personally to a governess whose name he had received that week in a letter from an unknown address. Barrow wrote with precision and without wasted words, which she found she respected, despite the somewhat chilling efficiency of it. He acknowledged the receipt of her communication of the 11th instant. He conveyed that his principal, the Duke, had received her communication and had attended to its content. He informed her that the Duke intended to attend the Hargrove estate on Saturday morning, in order to address the matter referred to in her letter. Saturday morning. Tomorrow. Clara sat with the letter in her hands and read it through twice. She noted that Barrow had said attend rather than visit, which was a deliberate word choice, precise, in a way that told her Barrow was a man who chose his words as a professional matter. She noted that the letter did not ask for confirmation of the time, or of whether Saturday was convenient, which told her that the Duke operated on the assumption that what he intended to do would proceed. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer of her desk. She sat at the window for 4 minutes, looking at the frost on the garden below, at the bare elm at the boundary, at the pale sky that had, she noticed, the particular flat quality of a sky that was considering snow, but had not yet decided. Then she got up, went downstairs, and spent the rest of the day being precisely as present in her work as she always was. She supervised the children's morning lessons with full attention. She took them for their afternoon walk and pointed out the difference between a field song thrush and a blackbird, and answered their questions about whether birds were cold in winter, with the thoroughness the question deserved. She ate her supper at the far end of the table and drank her tea and said nothing unusual. She went to the cottage at 4 o'clock with the usual things, and she sat in the chair and looked at Edward and said nothing about the letter. She talked about the children and the walk and the question about birds. She checked the cough. She made sure the wood was sufficient. She left the crackers and the fresh candle. At the door, she stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something in her expression must have shifted, some small thing she could not entirely prevent, because his gaze sharpened very slightly with the attention of someone who has seen the edge of something. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes?" she said. A pause. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she said, "everything is in hand." She went out and closed the door. She stood on the path in the cold dark and looked up at the sky, which had made its decision about the snow and had decided against it for tonight. The stars were visible through a gap in the clouds, very bright and very cold. Tomorrow, she thought. She walked back to the house. She did not sleep well. She had not expected to. She lay awake and thought about the morning, about what she would say to the Duke when he arrived, about what she would not say. She thought about how she would manage Mr. Hargrove, who would need to be briefed sufficiently that he did not do something unhelpful out of anxiety at the appearance of the Duke in his grounds. She thought about Edward in the cottage, sleeping, she hoped, without knowing that tomorrow was coming. She thought about the look on the Duke's face when he saw his father. She could not imagine it. She did not know the Duke's face. She only had the word that he was composed, that he showed nothing, that he managed everything with a particular controlled efficiency. These were descriptions of a surface. What was underneath the surface, tomorrow, she could not predict. She did not need to predict it. She only needed to do what was directly in front of her to do, which was to bring the Duke to the cottage and open the door and step aside. The rest was not her part of the story. She turned onto her side. She closed her eyes. She counted slowly to 100, which was an old trick of her father's for finding sleep, and by 73 she was out. In the morning, she woke early, as she always did, and dressed, and went downstairs, and there was nothing yet to indicate the day was different from any other day, except the particular quality of the waiting that had been with her all week, and which was, this morning, very nearly at its end. She waited. At breakfast, she poured her tea and watched the children argue about something involving a picture book, and she ate her porridge and answered Mr. Hargrove's question about the eldest child's progress in French, and she was entirely present in the room and entirely unreachable by anything in it. Saturday was coming the way Saturday always came, unavoidably, completely, and on its own schedule, rather than anyone else's. She had done what she could do. She had made the decision, written the letter, waited for the response, received it, and kept the information until the moment it was needed. She had managed the space between the decision and its consequence with what she believed was the appropriate amount of practical care. She had kept the fire going in the cottage. She had made sure Edward ate sufficiently. She had managed George and Mrs. Penny and Agnes and Mr. Hargrove and the children and the ordinary running of her professional life with enough steadiness that no one looking from the outside would have seen anything unusual. Now all that remained was the morning. She thought, eating her porridge, about what it meant that a letter she had written in 3 drafts in the middle of a weeknight, at a desk in a room the size of a modest wardrobe, was going to bring the Duke of Ashford to this particular estate on this particular Saturday. The thought had an unreal quality, the kind of unreality that settles over an action once it has been taken and cannot be retracted. The letter had left her pocket and traveled to Ashford Hall and had been read by someone important and had produced an effect in the world that she had intended it to produce. And now the effect was on its way and would arrive in the morning. She had done that, with a pen and 3 sheets of paper and a candle. She found this thought, considered honestly, both satisfying and somewhat terrifying, which she thought was probably the appropriate response to it. She finished her porridge. She drank her tea. She excused herself from the table and went to collect the children for their morning lesson. The morning passed. The children read and argued and solved sums with varying degrees of accuracy and enthusiasm, and Clara guided them through it with her usual combination of patience and precise direction, and the lesson was neither worse nor better than other mornings, which was as it should be. She went to the cottage before lunch. She brought the usual things. Edward was in the chair. He looked at her when she came in with the expression she had come to know well, direct, attentive, reading her carefully the way he read most things that interested him. "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "The Saturday deadline," he said. "It is tomorrow." "Yes," Clara said. He looked at the fire. You did write the letter." "Yes." "And?" She looked at him. She set the flask of tea on the table, and the bread and the cold meat beside it, and she sat in the chair, and she said, "He is coming tomorrow morning." Edward was very still. She did not say anything further. She poured the tea and put it in front of him, and sat with her hands in her lap, and let him have the silence he needed. He sat with it for a long time. "He is coming tomorrow," he said finally. "Yes," she said. He looked at the table. He looked at the book, which was open, as it often was now, on the table beside the tea. He looked at his hands. "You should have told me," he said, not with anger, with the quiet of someone identifying a fact. "Yes," Clara said, "I should have. I made the judgment that the waiting would be harder for you than the short notice. I may have been wrong about that." He considered this. "No," he said, after a moment, "you were probably right. I would have spent the week in a state that would have been unpleasant for everyone in the vicinity." "I thought as much," she said. "That does not mean the decision was entirely yours to make," he said. "No," she said, "it does not. I am sorry for the part of it that was not mine." He looked at her steadily. Then, very slowly, the ghost of something that might have been a smile. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Whitmore," he said. "So you have said," she said. "Drink your tea." He drank his tea. They sat together in the cottage for an hour, not speaking much, the fire burning down steadily, and the afternoon going gray at the window. Clara thought that this was possibly one of the last times they would sit exactly like this, in this particular cottage, in these particular chairs, with this particular quality of uncomplicated companionship that had grown between them over 12 days. Whatever tomorrow brought would change the shape of things. It always did. She did not say this. There was no point in saying it. She left at 5:30. She stood on the path for a moment. She looked up at the sky, which was very dark and very cold, and entirely without stars, a thick cloud cover coming in from the north. In the morning, the Duke of Ashford was coming. She turned and walked back to the house. The sound of carriage wheels on frozen gravel was distinctive from any other sound the morning made. Clara heard it from the upstairs corridor at 8:20, while she was helping Charles Hargrove with his coat buttons. The boy was talking about something. She could hear the words, but they were not, at that moment, reaching the part of her mind that processed their meaning. Then the sound came through the window at the end of the corridor, and all the other sounds arranged themselves around it. She finished the coat buttons. She settled Charles with his sister and a reading exercise and told them she would be back in 30 minutes. She went to the corridor window. The carriage was at the Hargrove gate, large, black, moving with the deliberate, unhurried weight of a vehicle that belonged to someone accustomed to having things wait for them, rather than the other way around. The Ashford crest on the panel of the door was visible from where she stood, even through the window, even at this distance. 2 dark horses, a coachman, and climbing down from the far side of the carriage, a figure in a dark wool coat who straightened as he stepped to the ground, with the economy of movement that belongs to people who have been in many rooms and many situations, and who have never needed to perform the act of being significant because they simply were. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a stillness about him even in motion that she found, from a distance, difficult to read. He looked at the gate first, then at the house, and then, very briefly, and with the expression of a man who has taken a breath and is about to do something, at the grounds beyond the gate. Frederick Barrow descended from the other side, and was at the Duke's shoulder almost immediately. Clara stepped back from the window. She went downstairs at a pace that was unhurried, because hurried was not the mode this morning required. Her coat was on its hook in the passage. She put it on. She buttoned it. She checked that her hair was in its usual order, which it was. She put her gloves on. She looked at herself briefly in the mirror beside the coat hooks. Ordinary face. Ordinary arrangement. Ordinary governess preparing for an ordinary Tuesday morning. And she opened the front door of the house and stepped outside. Mr. Hargrove had appeared in the doorway behind her, adjusting his coat lapels with the rapid, anxious gestures of a man who has been told the Duke of Ashford is at his gate and is now attempting to locate the correct behavioral response to this information in a very short period of time. She heard him behind her but did not look back. The Duke was at the gate when she reached it. His secretary was 2 steps behind. The coachman had stayed with the horses. Clara stopped at speaking distance and looked at the Duke of Ashford directly. He was perhaps 50, she thought. The dark eyes were his father's, the same quality of attention, the same sense of significant interior activity that was not, by design, made available to the outside. The face was composed in the specific, practiced way of someone who has been composing themselves for a very long time and has become excellent at it. His coat was very fine. His posture was exact. He was, in every visible detail, precisely what his reputation suggested. A man who managed things effectively and showed nothing. But he had come. He had come on a Saturday morning, in person, without sending a proxy or a letter or a formal instruction. He had come. "Your Grace," Clara said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and entirely controlled. "You are the governess who wrote to me." "I am," she said. He looked at her with the attentive, evaluating expression of someone reading more than the surface of what they are being shown. "Is he here?" "Yes," Clara said. "Is he well?" "Better than he was," she said. "Not yet entirely well." Something moved through his expression. Very briefly, a thing that was present for perhaps a second, and then was contained. She would not have caught it at all if she had not been watching for it. Something between relief and something harder to name. Something that had to do with the specific quality of hearing a fact you had been not quite admitting you wanted to hear. "I would like to see him," the Duke said. "Of course," Clara said. "I'll take you." She turned and led the way through the side gate in the Hargrove outer wall, across the grounds toward the south boundary, and the yew hedge, beyond which the cottage sat. She walked at a pace that was purposeful and slightly slower than her usual pace, because the grounds were icy in places, and because the Duke deserved a few minutes of open air before he arrived at the door. They walked without speaking for a moment. Then the Duke said, "How did you find him?" "He was on the bench outside the estate gate," she said, "before 5 in the morning. He had fallen on the ice. He was injured, and soaked through, and he had been there for some time." The Duke said, "And you brought him in?" "Yes." "Did he tell you who he was?" "He gave me his first name when I asked," she said. "Edward. That was all, initially." "And later?" "I determined the rest from other sources," she said. "He did not tell me himself." The Duke absorbed this. "When you learned who he was," he said, "did it change how you were treating him?" "No," Clara said. "The situation was the same. He needed the same things. The name did not alter what he needed." She heard the Duke make a sound that was not quite a word, something very slight, more acknowledgement than response. They crossed the frost-white grass and came around the yew hedge to the path that led to the cottage. The chimney was smoking in a thin, steady thread. The cottage window showed warm light behind it. At the gate in the hedge, the Duke stopped walking. Clara stopped beside him. He looked at the cottage. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been not quite thinking about for a long time, with the particular, complex attention of recognition and preparation, and a steadying of oneself that is almost invisible, but not quite. Clara waited. "You wrote to me," he said, without looking at her, still looking at the cottage, "even though you had no obligation to do so, and no connection to this family, and no reason to involve yourself, beyond the simple fact of finding a man on a bench." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She had known he would ask. She had prepared an answer in her mind more than once in the days between sending the letter and this morning. She had tried several versions of the answer and found them insufficient, too elaborate, too justifying, too much of her own thinking, and not enough of the simple truth. "Because a son should know where his father is," she said. Silence. She said it without accusation, without the edge that it might have carried, if she had meant it as a reproach. She said it in the same plain, direct way she said everything important, which was without decoration, simply as a fact she believed, and was offering without pressure or interpretation. He was very quiet. Then he walked forward, and Clara walked beside him, and they reached the cottage door together. She stopped at the door. She did not knock. She looked at the Duke. He looked at the door. She had a sense, in that moment, of standing at the edge of something that had been a long time building and was now, in the next 30 seconds, going to exist or not exist. The door between where they were standing and where Edward was sitting was a very ordinary door. Old wood, a latch handle, a gap at the bottom where the winter cold got in, despite the draft cloth she had pressed against it. But it was also not ordinary at all, in the way that ordinary things sometimes are not, when the thing on the other side of them is something a person has been walking toward and away from for 14 months. She knocked twice. She heard nothing for a moment, then a single word, "Come in." She lifted the latch. She pushed the door open. She stepped back. She looked at the Duke. He met her eyes briefly, and in that brief meeting she saw, just for a fraction of a second, the actual face of him, not the managed face, the real one. And it was the face of a man who was afraid. Genuinely afraid, in the way that only the most important things can produce in a person who has spent years ensuring that nothing can produce it in them. He walked in. Clara pulled the door closed behind him. She stood on the cold path outside the closed door. She could hear nothing through the thick old walls. Not voices, not movement, nothing. Just the morning around her, a wood pigeon somewhere in the kitchen garden, the faint sound of the frost settling, the distant sound of George's work at the stable. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she straightened. put her hands in her coat pockets, and walked away from the cottage, across the frost-white grounds toward the house. She did not look back. She had done what was hers to do. The rest belonged to the two people inside, and it had always belonged to them, and she had only ever been the thing that made the distance between them small enough to cross. She walked steadily, with her hands in her pockets, across the white and glittering grounds, breathing the cold, clean air. Behind her, in the cottage, a door stood closed. On the other side of it, two people were in the same room, for the first time in a very long time. She did not know what would happen next. She knew only that it was happening, and that it might not have happened without a bench and a gate and a woman with cold hands, who had been walking to the post box before dawn, and had heard a sound she could not walk past. She reached the house and opened the door and went inside to continue the morning. Inside, the household had arranged itself around the disruption with varying degrees of success. Mr. Hargrove was in his study, with the door firmly shut, which was his preferred location during events that exceeded his social processing capacity. Agnes was in the upper corridor pretending to dust a shelf that she had probably already dusted twice, positioned with a clear view of the window that looked out over the grounds toward the south boundary. Mrs. Penny was in the kitchen, making bread with the focused, physical intensity she brought to things, when she was managing an excess of feeling that she had no other channel for. Charles and his sister were, as Clara had left them, in the schoolroom with their reading. She checked on them, answered their questions about the carriage at the gate with the minimum of information required, and settled them with additional exercises before she came back downstairs. She took her coat off. She put the kettle on the range and thought about nothing in particular while it boiled. She poured herself a cup of tea and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the grounds. The carriage was still at the gate. Frederick Barrow was standing beside it, with the upright, impassive posture of a man who spends a significant portion of his professional life waiting and has developed a systematic way of doing it. The coachman sat on the box with his hat low and his collar turned up against the cold and the resigned patience of his profession. The cottage chimney still smoked steadily. Mrs. Penny came to stand beside her at the window, the bread dough forgotten on the board. She looked at the chimney. She looked at the carriage. She said nothing. "He came," Clara said. "Yes," said Mrs. Penny. They stood there for a few minutes together, looking at the thin thread of smoke against the pale sky. "Do you think he'll be all right?" Mrs. Penny said, without specifying which she meant, and Clara answered for both of them. "Yes," she said, "I think so." She did not know it. She believed it. That was not the same thing, but it was the best she had to offer, and it was, she thought, enough for this moment. Mrs. Penny seemed to find it enough. She went back to her bread. Clara stood at the window and drank her tea, and watched the chimney smoke, and waited. The children needed her at 11. She went upstairs and taught for an hour, with the kind of focused, genuine attention that required her to be entirely present, and she was, because the children did not deserve anything less than her full presence, and full presence was something she could always give when she chose to. But she was also, at the same time, entirely aware of the clock on the schoolroom mantel, and of the number of minutes that had now passed since she had closed the cottage door. At noon, she went downstairs. She looked out the kitchen window. The carriage was still there. Frederick Barrow was still standing beside it. She made sandwiches for the children's lunch, which Agnes helped her carry upstairs. She ate her own lunch standing at the kitchen board, looking at the window. At 12:30, she could not do anything else that did not require going across the grounds. She put her coat back on. She walked to the cottage. She was halfway across the grounds when she heard footsteps behind her and slowed. It was George, crossing from the direction of the stable with a bucket. He fell into step beside her without being asked. They walked together to the yew hedge. Beyond it, the cottage door was closed, and the chimney smoked, and the morning had been very long. Clara went through the hedge gate, and George stayed outside it, not following, simply present, in the way he had been present throughout the last weeks. Steady, and quiet, and reliable, in the way of someone who does not need to be explained things to understand them. Clara went to the cottage door. She stood in front of it for a moment. She thought about what might be behind it. She thought about Edward in the chair, and about what it might look like to have his son in the same room, after 14 months of walking away from the question of what that son's face would hold. She thought about the Duke's controlled composure, and what it might have done in 2 hours, in a small warm cottage, with a man who had spent 14 months alone. She knocked. It was the Duke who opened the door. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and something had changed in the shape of him. Not the face itself. The features were the same. The composure was present. The control was not entirely gone. But there was a quality in him that had been different before. Less rigid, not softer. She would not have said softer. More honest, perhaps. The composure was no longer armor. It was simply him, and it was not holding anything back anymore, because there was nothing left to hold back from. He looked tired, not the tired of a long journey. The good tired, the tired of someone who has been somewhere necessary and demanding, and is now on the other side of it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "I am sorry to interrupt." "You are not interrupting," he said. He stepped back from the doorway. She went in. Edward was in the chair by the fire. He was sitting upright, both hands resting open on his knees, in a way that was entirely unlike how he had held them in the early days of his time in the cottage. The tight grip, the managed tension. He was looking at the fire. When Clara came in, he turned his head and looked at her, and she saw something in his face that she could not have predicted and could not fully name, but that she thought, looking at it carefully, was the expression of a man who has put down something very heavy and is still adjusting to the change in how he carries himself without it. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been somewhere far away and was now, for the first time in a long time, present in the room he was actually sitting in. "I made tea," the Duke said, from behind her. She turned. He had moved to the small table where the flask and cups were, and he was occupied with this in the practical, matter-of-fact way of a man who has discovered that ordinary things are sometimes exactly what a difficult morning requires. "I used the flask. I hope that is acceptable." "Of course," Clara said. He poured 3 cups without asking, which Clara noticed, because a man who assumed she would stay, who did not pour 2 and then pause, was a man who had, in the last 2 hours, made some adjustment in how he was operating. He set the cups on the table. He remained standing. He looked at his father for a moment, and Edward looked at him, and between them was the particular, complex silence of people who have spent 2 hours in a small room saying things they have been carrying for a long time, and are now in the quiet on the other side of it. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said, turning to her. "My father has told me something about the last 12 days, about what you did when you found him, and what you have done since." Clara looked at him steadily. "I did what was in front of me to do," she said. "That is all." "That is not all," the Duke said. He said it without emphasis, without performance. He said it as a simple correction of an insufficient statement. "That is never all, when someone chooses to stop where others would have kept walking. And I know, because I asked my father whether he had called for help when you found him. He had not. He would not have." He paused. "You stopped because you chose to. That is a particular kind of thing. It has a particular kind of value." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to add to this that would improve it. "My father told me something else," the Duke said. He looked at Edward briefly, and Edward looked at his hands, with the expression of a man who has said something he meant and is not taking it back. "He told me that when you found out who he was, nothing changed. That you looked at him the same way, brought him the same things, sat in the same chair and talked the same way." He paused. He said that was the thing he will not forget. Not the practical help, though he is grateful for the practical help. The other thing. Clara looked at Edward. He was looking at the fire again, but there was something in the set of his face that told her he had said exactly what he had wanted to say. "He is a person," Clara said simply. "He was a person on a bench who needed help. That is what I saw." "I know," the Duke said. "That is precisely the thing." He picked up his cup of tea. He was quiet for a moment. The fire made its sounds. The afternoon had gone gray at the window, the sky low and close, and the small room held its warmth against it like a promise. "I owe you a debt, Miss Whitmore," the Duke said. "I intend to pay it, if you will allow me to determine the form. That is a conversation for another day. Today, I only want to say it." Clara looked at him. "You owe me nothing," she said. "But if it gives you some satisfaction to believe otherwise, I will not argue the point." Something moved in the Duke's expression, not quite a smile. She was not sure his face did that easily, but an easing of the precise control, a slight softening at the corners of his eyes that suggested that somewhere behind the managed surface there was a person who found this somewhat funny. "Father told me you were like that," he said. "Like what?" Clara asked. "Unimpressible," he said. "Practical," Clara said. Edward, from the chair by the fire, said quietly, "She says there is a difference." Clara looked at him. He was still looking at the fire, but the corners of his mouth had moved. "There is a difference," she said. The Duke looked at his father. His father looked at the fire. And between them was the particular quiet of people who have, in 2 hours, done some work that needed doing, and are now sitting in the early, tentative territory that is on the other side of that work. Not resolved, not healed, nothing so neat as either of those words, but different from before. A different kind of together than the together they had been in before the 14 months, and the bench, and the letter, and this morning. Clara set her untouched cup of tea on the table. She picked up her coat from the hook. "I will leave you," she said. "There is more tea in the flask." She looked at Edward. He looked back at her. In his eyes was something she had not seen there before. Something warm and old and not easily named. The look of a man who has been given something back that he had not known was possible to recover. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," he said. He said it quietly, with the full weight of a man who was saying 2 words and meaning something considerably larger. "You're very welcome, Edward," she said. She said it in the same tone she said everything, plain and direct and without decoration, because that was her way, and it had served her well. She put her coat on. She went to the door. She opened it, and the cold afternoon came in briefly, and she stepped out and pulled the door shut behind her. She stood on the path outside the closed cottage door, for the second time that day. The afternoon was very still. The frost on the grass caught the low winter light and threw it back in small, cold points. George was somewhere beyond the yew hedge, invisible, present in the way he always was. The Ashford carriage was still at the Hargrove gate. Frederick Barrow was still at his post beside it, upright and efficient and patient, the ideal secretary for a man who needed things managed. Clara stood on the path and breathed the cold, clean air, and looked at the bare branches of the apple tree against the low gray sky. Everything felt different than it had this morning, and she could not have said precisely what was different, only that the weight that had been sitting in her chest since she sealed the letter and posted it had lifted, and in its place was something quieter and lighter, and more like satisfaction than relief. The particular satisfaction of someone who has done a thing correctly and knows it, not through praise or acknowledgement, but through the simple fact of the thing having been done. She turned and walked back through the yew hedge gate and across the grounds toward the house. Behind her, in the cottage, 2 people who had not been in the same room for a very long time were sitting beside a fire that she had kept going for 12 days. She walked. The Ashford carriage was still at the Hargrove gate when Clara came in from the grounds, and Frederick Barrow was still beside it, and the cold had not apparently persuaded him to move from his position or to request any accommodation from the house. Clara went inside and took her coat off and hung it on the hook and went upstairs to see to the children, who had finished their reading and were beginning to negotiate with each other about what came next in the way that children, who have been left alone for too long, negotiate, with escalating volume and decreasing coherence. She settled them with an afternoon task that required cooperation rather than competition. A map of England they would draw together, which kept both their hands occupied and required them to talk to each other at a moderate volume about things that could be verified by reference to the geography book, and she went back downstairs. She made a fresh pot of tea in the kitchen. Mrs. Penny was kneading bread with the concentrated energy of someone managing a great deal of interior occupation, and she looked up when Clara came in and looked back down at the bread, which told Clara that the kitchen had been a site of some significant thinking over the past 3 hours. "The carriage is still there," Mrs. Penny said. "Yes," Clara said. "Is that a good sign or a bad one?" Clara thought about this honestly. "Good, I think," she said. If it were a bad conversation, it would have been short. Mrs. Penny considered this. She turned the bread over with a decisive motion. "How long?" she said. "I don't know," Clara said. "However long it takes." She poured her tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the thin thread of smoke from the cottage chimney and thought about what was happening inside the cottage, and then deliberately stopped thinking about it, because it was not hers to think about. She had done what she could do. She had brought them to the same room and closed the door. What happened in the room was between them. She drank her tea. She went back upstairs. She sat with the children and checked their map, which had England's rivers somewhat optimistically positioned, but otherwise accurately rendered, and she praised the accuracy and gently corrected the rivers, and the afternoon went on. At 4 o'clock, she heard the carriage move. She went to the window at the end of the upper corridor and looked out. The carriage was at the gate still, but it had turned. The coachman had the horses moving, the carriage describing a slow arc in preparation for departure. Frederick Barrow was at the gate, looking toward the house with the expression of a man awaiting something. And coming across the grounds from the direction of the yew hedge, walking side by side, were two men. One was the Duke of Ashford, his coat dark against the white frost of the grounds, his stride its usual controlled, purposeful pace. The other was Edward, walking without a stick, without assistance, at an unhurried pace that had in it some quality Clara had not seen in his walk before, a quality of ease, of a man whose bearing had returned to something more natural to him than anything she had seen in 12 days. She watched them walk together across the grounds. She watched them stop at the gate. She could not hear what passed between them. She could only see the Duke, facing his father with the composed face that had softened somewhat in 3 hours. Edward, standing upright in the coat she had buttoned on his first morning in the cottage. She watched them stand at the gate for a few minutes. She saw something pass between them that she could not interpret from a distance. A gesture, an inclination of the head, something that had the quality of a conclusion rather than a continuation. Then Edward turned and walked back toward the cottage, and the Duke turned and spoke to Frederick Barrow, and Barrow opened the carriage door, and the Duke climbed in. The carriage moved down the lane. Clara stood at the window and watched it go. She took a breath and let it out slowly. Then she went back to the children and their map. Edward's light was still burning in the cottage window when she crossed the grounds at 4:30 with the evening's food. The frost on the grass was heavier than it had been that morning. The temperature had dropped steadily through the day, and her boots made a sharp sound with every step. She knocked twice. "Come in," he said. He was in the chair by the fire, where he was every evening, but something was different in how he sat in it. He sat in it the way a man sits in a chair when the chair belongs to him, fully, without the reservation she had seen in his posture in the early days, without the quality of a man occupying temporarily a space he did not feel he had the right to. He looked up when she came in. His face was tired. Not the bad tired. Not the tired of illness or of pain or of the cold. The tired of someone who has spent 3 hours doing something that required everything they had, and who is sitting on the other side of it, and who is very much at rest. "He stayed for 3 hours," Clara said. She said it simply, not as a question. "Yes," Edward said. She set the food on the table and poured the tea and sat down. She did not ask him about the conversation. She had no right to ask, and more importantly, whatever had passed between them in the cottage was not a thing that needed to be reported to her or processed aloud for her benefit. It was theirs. But he told her. Not all of it. She understood that all of it was not hers to have. But some of it, the parts that had been, she gathered, the ones he most needed to say out loud, to put into the air in the presence of another person. His son had sat in the chair she was sitting in now, he said, and had looked at him with the composed face that showed nothing, and had then done something that Edward had not seen him do since the boy was very young. He had looked down at his hands. And then he had said, "I do not know how to explain to you what the last 2 years have been. I do not know how to explain to you what it cost me to ask you to go. I know that it cost you more. I know that. And I know that knowing it and having done it anyway is not a combination I can defend to you or to myself. But I need you to know that I knew it, that I did not send you away without understanding what I was doing." He had stopped there, Edward said. He had looked at his hands for a while, and then he had said, "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am not sure I have the right to ask for that yet. I am only telling you that I understand the size of what happened, and that I want to do differently, going forward, if you will allow that." Edward was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I told him," he said, "that I had not been without fault, that the business with Oliver was a failure of my own vigilance, as much as Oliver's judgment, and that the damage it caused him was real, and I knew it was real, and I had never intended it, but intention was not the point. I told him I had agreed to go partly because I had not trusted my own judgment about whether to fight the request, and that I was no longer certain the decision to go had been the right one, or merely the most comfortable one. He looked at Clara. And then I told him about you, he said, about the bench and the cottage, about the soup and the fire and the 12 days, about the book, about the things you said about practical versus kind. He paused. I told him about your father, about what you said about knowing a thing is true and living it being a long distance apart. He was quiet. I told him that you had made it possible for me to be in this room rather than on another bench somewhere, and that if he was going to know something about what had happened in the last 2 weeks, he should know that. Because I thought it was something he needed to understand, that people exist who simply do the thing in front of them without requiring that it be easy first. Clara looked at the fire. What did he say? She said after a moment. Edward looked at her with the steady dark eyes that had looked at her so many times in the last 12 days, across so many conversations, in this small, warm room. He said, Edward said slowly, that he had read your letter 3 times before he came this morning. That the first time he read it, he thought it was a manageable situation that needed handling. That the second time he read it, he understood it was more than that. And that the third time he read it, he understood that you were writing not merely to inform him, but to give him an opportunity that he had not known he still had. Clara said nothing. She sat with that for a moment. He asked, Edward continued, whether I thought you would consider a position at Ashford Hall. Clara looked at him. I told him, Edward said, that I did not know. That you were a person who made her own decisions on her own terms, and that the most he could do was offer it clearly and without pressure, and leave the rest to you. He paused. He said he thought he could do that. Clara looked at the fire. She looked at the table. She looked at the tea in her cup. And you? She said. What do you think? Edward was quiet for a moment. He looked at the book on the table, which was almost entirely read through now, the pages worn soft from a month of handling. I think, he said, that Ashford Hall is a place that needs something it has not had for some time, a person who sees clearly and does what is in front of them without waiting for it to be convenient. He paused. I think you would be very good at it. I think you would find it interesting. And I think, though this is perhaps more than I have the standing to say, that you deserve something better than what this position can offer you. Clara looked at him. That is 3 separate opinions, she said. Yes, he said. I have many. The ghost of the smile. The real one, the one that had shown up after the fever, and had been appearing more regularly since. She had come to understand that it was his actual face, the one he had before everything went wrong, and that seeing it appear with increasing frequency was a measurement she had been taking without quite knowing she was taking it. She drank her tea. They sat in the cottage in the warmth of the fire for a while longer. The evening was entirely dark outside the window by now, and the frost was brilliant and deep on the grounds, and somewhere beyond the yew hedge, George was checking the wood stack for the evening. He is going to come back, Edward said. Yes, Clara said. I know. Not immediately, Edward said. There are arrangements to be made, and we are not at the end of a road, the 2 of us. We are at the beginning of one, a very uncertain beginning. He was quiet, but he came, and he said what he said, and that is a beginning. Yes, Clara said. It is. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. The firelight was on his face, and he was a man who was tired and warm and sitting in a chair, as though the chair was his, and there was a quality about him that she had not seen on the bench or in the early days of the cottage, a groundedness, a settled quality, as though the long wandering had found, in this strange and unexpected way, its rest. She stood and collected the evening's things. She put on her coat. She went to the door. I will be back in the morning, she said. Yes, he said. I know. She opened the door. The cold came in briefly. Miss Whitmore, he said. She turned. He looked at her from the chair. Thank you, he said. He said it the way he said the important things, simply, plainly, with the full weight of what he meant behind it, rather than in front of it. "Good night, Edward," she said. She went out into the cold and closed the door behind her. She stood on the frost-white path for a moment and looked up at the sky, which was very dark and full of stars, brilliant and cold and very far away. Then she walked back to the house. She had a great deal to think about. She thought about it that night in her room, with the candle low, and her coat hanging on the hook, and her hands folded on the desk in front of her. She did not take out a sheet of paper. She did not pick up her pen. She just sat at the desk and thought with the particular, careful quality she brought to things that mattered, going slowly around the edges of the decision, rather than straight at the center of it. She thought about what it meant, practically. A new position at a different household. A larger establishment, more complex, more people, and more demands, and less of the particular predictable quietness of the Hargrove house. A different county, or at least the different part of this one. Ashford Hall was 20 miles further into the county interior, she calculated, which was not an impossible distance, but was a distance. She thought about the children at Ashford Hall, the two young cousins she had not yet met, who presumably needed a governess, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and had simply been in the house when this situation arose. She thought about whether she was the right person for that work, and she thought she probably was, because she was the right person for most children with enough patience and the right approach. She thought about Mr. Hargrove, and what she owed him, and what she did not. She thought about Mrs. Penny, and George, and Agnes, all of whom had wrapped themselves quietly around the situation of the last 12 days, with the undemonstrative solidarity that was the best kind of solidarity. She thought about whether leaving them would be a loss, and she decided it would be a loss, but not the kind of loss that should prevent a thing. She thought about Edward. She thought about sitting in the cottage chair every day, across the table from him, with the fire and the book and the tea and the conversations that ranged from Marcus Aurelius to the proper drainage of kitchen gardens to the question of what her father would have thought of the current arrangements in English education. She thought about what it had been to be in that room, and about what it had given her that she had not known she was in need of. The particular company of a person who thought carefully, and said what they meant, and received what she said, with the same seriousness she gave to it. She thought about the Duke's face at the cottage door when he had stepped back from it, the managed composure with something underneath it that she had seen for only a second, the real face of a man who was afraid in the way that only important things can make a person afraid. She thought about the letter he would write. She was fairly certain he would write one. The offer had been made through Edward this evening, but a man of the Duke's character would not leave a significant arrangement to a verbal transmission through a third party. He would write. He would be precise and clear, and probably fairly formal, and somewhere in the formality, there would be the offer. She did not know yet whether she would accept it. She thought she would, but she wanted to be certain of the reason, because she had a strong commitment to doing things for the right reason, rather than the comfortable one. The right reason was not that she had become fond of Edward in 12 days, though she had. It was not that the position would be more interesting or better paid, or in a larger house, though it would be all of those things. It was not even that the Duke had a face that was more complicated than it first appeared, and that complicated faces usually indicated complicated people, and she found complicated people more interesting to work alongside than uncomplicated ones. The right reason, the one she came back to when she had turned everything else over carefully, was that she had spent 12 days being useful in a way that felt entirely like the right use of herself, not in the sense of dramatic consequence or visible impact, but in the simple, unglamorous sense of someone who had identified what was needed and had provided it accurately. She had been, in those 12 days, a version of herself that felt more natural than the self she was in the ordinary management of lessons and schedules and the small social requirements of the Hargrove household. She wanted more of that, not the drama of it. There would be no more benches and fevers and Dukes appearing on Saturday mornings, most likely. But the quality of the work, the quality of being genuinely useful to people who needed something she was able to give. She was not entirely sure Ashford Hall could offer that, but she thought it might be possible. She thought it was worth finding out. She blew out the candle. She went to bed. In the morning she went to the cottage with the usual things, and found Edward in the chair, and she sat across from him, and they drank their tea, and talked about a passage in the book he had been reading the previous evening, and she did not mention the position, or the Duke, or the conversation of last night, and neither did he. Some things were better left to settle on their own, without being touched. She let it settle. Edward's trunk was packed, and standing beside the cottage door, when Clara arrived on the morning of December the 12th. She had known it would be. The Duke's carriage was due at 10 o'clock, and it was 8:30 now, and Edward was a man who organized things in advance as a matter of long habit. The trunk was dark leather and plain, and it had been sent by Frederick Barrow on the previous afternoon. It was not large. It did not need to be large. In 12 days, a man did not accumulate much. Edward was in the chair. He was sitting in it, with both hands in his lap and his coat already on, pressed and buttoned, his hair neat. He was looking at the trunk, with the particular look of a man looking at something that represents a significant change and is not yet sure how to hold that fact. He looked up when she came in. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good morning, Edward," she said. She set the flask and the morning food on the table. She built the fire up from the low coals of the night, because the room was cold, and they had an hour and a half yet, and there was no reason to sit in the cold when there was wood in the stack. She got the fire going and adjusted the vents, and sat down across from him and poured the tea. He poured his own, which was the first time he had done that. She noticed it without comment. They drank. Outside the cottage window, the morning was pale and very clear, the frost deep, and the sky the clean white blue of a winter day that intended to be cold and bright throughout. The bare apple tree in the kitchen garden held its empty branches in the still air. A pair of crows moved methodically along the outer wall, picking at something with the focused attention that crows bring to everything. "I have been reading," Edward said. He gestured toward the book on the table, which lay open to the final pages. He had been reading it now for 12 days, and was very near the end. "There is a line near the close that I have been sitting with this morning." He looked at it. "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. That is the whole of it, isn't it? The whole problem." "Yes," Clara said. "I think it might be." "I broke my word," he said, looking at the page. "Not in the business. That was Oliver's breaking, not mine. But in another way. I gave my son the impression, over many years, that I saw him clearly and valued what I saw. And then when the difficulty came, I was silent about it in the way of a man who had let his grief undo his courage." He looked at the fire. "That was a kind of breaking. I think he knew it was. I think that is part of what made the last 2 years what they were." Clara looked at him. "And now?" she asked. "And now, I am going to try to be the kind of man who does not break it again," he said simply. "I cannot promise to succeed, but I intend to try, which is more than I was doing in November." He picked up his teacup. "You helped me understand that," he said. "You and this book." Clara looked at the book. The cover worn soft, the spine cracked in the particular pattern of a book read many times. Her father's copy, carried in her coat pocket every day for 12 years. "I want you to take the book," she said. He looked at her. "It was your father's." "Yes," she said, "and he would have wanted it to go somewhere it was needed. He was that kind of man." She paused. "I know the text well enough to carry it without the book. I have read it often enough that it is simply in me now." "You should keep it," Edward said. He set it on the table between them and pushed it gently toward her. She pushed it back. "Take it," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the book. He picked it up and held it in both hands, looking at the cover. "You are a remarkably difficult person to argue with," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "We have established that." He held the book for a moment, then he placed it carefully in the breast pocket of his coat. She could see, by the way it fit there, that his coat had a pocket that was exactly the right size for it. A nice coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence at all. He looked up at her, and there it was, the real smile, the one that had appeared first after the fever, and which she had been keeping a private count of since then, the one that showed the face of the man he had been before shame and grief, and 14 months of walking had rearranged the surface of him. It was the face of a man who liked things, and found life interesting, and had, at some fundamental level, not been broken by any of it, only bent. "You," he said, "are an extraordinary woman, Clara Whitmore." "You have said that before," she said. "And I will likely say it again," he said. "I find that certain observations bear repeating." She laughed. It surprised her slightly, the ease of it. She had not laughed much in the last 12 days. There had been much to manage, and laughter required a loosening she had not entirely allowed herself. But this morning, with the trunk by the door, and the fire going, and the pale blue sky at the window, she laughed briefly, and genuinely, and he looked at her with the real smile, and the warmth behind the dark eyes that she had learned to recognize. "Your letter came yesterday," she said, after a moment. "The Duke's letter." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "He told me he had written it." "He writes well," she said. "Precisely. Without excess." "Yes," Edward said. "He always has." She looked at her tea. "He says the room has good light in the mornings." Edward was quiet for a moment. Then, "The east-facing rooms always have the best light. The estate was built with that in mind." Cecilia loved the mornings for that reason. Clara looked at the window. The pale winter morning light was coming directly through it now, falling clean and flat across the table between them, warming the wood, putting a golden edge on the teacup. She thought about a room with good morning light. She thought about what she had decided. In her room, on the night of the Duke's visit, sitting at her desk, with the candle low, and her hands folded. She had not changed her mind since then. She had let it settle, as she had told herself to, and it had settled in the same place it had been on that night, quietly, completely, in the direction of yes. "I am going to accept the position," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "Good," he said. He said it simply, with the quiet completeness of a man who has been hoping for something and is now told it is happening. "Good. I am very glad." "I have conditions," she said. "Of course," he said. "I run my own classroom," she said. "Without interference from anyone else in the household about curriculum, method, or schedule. I answer to the Duke on matters concerning his cousin's welfare and progress, but the day-to-day management of the schoolroom is mine." "Understood," Edward said. "I require one evening per week entirely free," she said. "No household duties, no social obligations, no availability for anything except my own reading and thinking." "That is entirely reasonable," he said. "And I will visit Mrs. Penny," she said. "Periodically. She made me a traveling cake, and that deserves to be remembered." Edward looked at her for a moment, and the real smile came again, fuller this time. "I will ensure you have the use of a carriage," he said. She nodded. She looked at the fire. "All right," she said. "Then it is decided." They sat together in the small warm room for the remaining time before the carriage came, and Clara was aware, in the particular way she was aware of endings as they were happening, that this was the last morning of this specific thing, this cottage, these chairs, this arrangement of two people in a small warm room talking over tea. That from today forward, if they talked over tea, it would be in a different room, a different context, in the territory of a new and different thing. She would not call it worse, but it would be different, and she wanted to hold this last morning with the fullness of attention it deserved. They talked about the kitchen garden and whether it would be worth planting herbs in the spring. They talked about what Edward had told his son about the Marcus Aurelius, and whether the Duke was the kind of man who would read it. They talked about the children at Ashford Hall, whom Edward described as energetic and curious, and somewhat startled by stillness, which Clara said sounded manageable, and probably interesting. They talked about what her room at the hall would look like, and Edward said the east-facing rooms were the warmest in the mornings, and that the view across the east lawn in winter frost was very fine. At 9:45, Clara heard the sound of carriage wheels on the Hargrove gravel, distant but distinct. She stood. She collected the morning things with the practiced efficiency of 12 days. She put on her coat. She looked at the empty bowl and the empty cup and the flask and the tin of crackers she had left this morning, as she always did, and she thought that the next person in this cottage would find a clean, warm, well-stocked room, and George would see to the wood and Mrs. Penny would see to whatever else was needed, and the cottage would go on being what it was. She picked up the trunk Edward made to take it. She shook her head. "I have carried heavier," she said, "and you are going to walk across frozen gravel, and I need both your hands free to manage the footing." He accepted this without argument, which she thought was itself a measure of how far 12 days had come from the first morning, when pride would not have permitted it. They went out together, into the brilliant cold morning air, the frost crunching with every step, the sky so blue and clear it was almost painful to look at directly. They crossed the estate grounds at his pace, which was steady now, no longer the careful managed pace of a man in pain, but the ordinary pace of a man who was going somewhere. At the Hargrove gate, the carriage waited. The same black carriage, the same Ashford crest, the same two dark horses breathing steam in the morning cold. Frederick Barrow was at the carriage door. Mrs. Penny was in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, looking at nothing in particular in the general direction of the gate. George appeared from the direction of the stable and took the trunk from Clara's hands, with a nod, and put it on the carriage, without being asked. Agnes appeared at the upper window, saw them, and pulled back from it, with the abruptness of someone who had been watching and had been caught. Clara put the trunk in Barrow's hands. Edward turned to her at the carriage step. He looked at her directly in the way he had looked at her for 12 days, with the full, careful attention of a man who had been given something important, and knew it, and intended not to be careless with the knowledge. "When you arrive at Ashford Hall," he said, "Nora the housekeeper will show you to your room. She is efficient, and will anticipate what you need. The east corridor is cold at night. There is an extra blanket in the wardrobe. The morning light in those rooms is best before 9 o'clock. After that it shifts." Clara looked at him. "I am telling you practical things," he said, with the ghost of the smile, "because you have told me for 12 days that practical is what you are." "Yes," she said, "I appreciate it." He looked at her for a moment more. "Thank you," he said, "not for the 12 days, though the 12 days were— I do not have a word large enough for what the 12 days were." He paused. "For seeing me when I had made it very easy not to be seen. That was the thing, Clara. That is what I will carry." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she might say, and she chose the simplest one, because the simplest one was true. "You were never invisible to me, Edward," she said. "You just happened to be on the right bench, on the right morning." He smiled. The real smile. The full one. "Go," she said. "The morning is getting away from you." He got into the carriage. Barrow closed the door. The carriage moved, the wheels crunching over the frozen gravel, turning in the lane and picking up pace as it reached the road proper. Clara stood at the Hargrove gate and watched it go. She watched until it turned at the bend beyond the bare elms and disappeared from sight, and then she stood looking at the empty lane for a moment longer, in the clear, cold, brilliant air, with the frost on the gate under her hands, and the crows picking their way across the grounds behind her. Then she turned and went back inside. The days that followed were ordinary, and, on the surface, exactly as they had always been. The children had their lessons. Mr. Hargrove had his correspondence. Mrs. Penny made her bread. George saw to the horses in the grounds. Agnes dusted the things that needed dusting. But the cottage at the south edge of the property was empty, and Clara knew it was empty, and the knowing of it was a presence of a kind that she had not expected. Not grief, exactly, and not loss in the sharp, specific sense, but a quality of absence that existed alongside the ordinary days, like a shadow thrown at an unexpected angle. She managed it as she managed most things, by working through it rather than around it. On the Wednesday of the following week, a letter arrived. She recognized the seal immediately and took it upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. There were 3 things inside the envelope. The first was a bank draft for a sum that made her sit very still for a full minute. It was more than she earned in 3 years at the Hargrove household. It was sufficient to give her a degree of financial independence she had not had in her adult life. Sufficient, carefully managed, to give her choices and the particular freedom that choices provide. The second was a letter from Frederick Barrow. It was precisely composed and entirely clear, and offered her the position of governess to the 2 young Ashford cousins currently resident at the Hall, with a salary considerably beyond her current one, a room and meals included, and the specific terms she would have expected from a man who organized large amounts of information for a living. The third was shorter and in a different hand. She recognized it from the letter he had written before, sharp and angular and direct, the hand of someone who wrote to be understood rather than to be admired. He wrote, his father was recovering well and had already offered 2 unsolicited opinions about the management of the East Lawn, which William had received in the spirit he was attempting to find for such things. He wrote that Ashford Hall was a household that had needed, for some time, someone of her particular character, someone who saw clearly and acted without waiting for the action to become convenient. He wrote that the position was hers if she wanted it, that he asked nothing and pressured nothing, that the choice was entirely and without condition her own. He wrote that his father had told him about her father's copy of Marcus Aurelius, and that he had placed a new copy on the desk in the east-facing room, because he thought she should have something to mark the beginning of a new chapter, since she had been responsible for beginning several others. He ended, "The room has good light in the mornings. I thought you should know that." Clara read it through twice. She folded it and placed it in the drawer of her desk with the other letter. She sat at the window for a long time. She looked at the frost on the kitchen garden below. She looked at the bare elm at the boundary. She looked at the south edge of the property, where the yew hedge made a dark line against the pale sky, and where, beyond it, a cottage stood empty now, with a swept floor and a cold stove and a wood stack that George had neatly replenished. She got up. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. She sat at her desk and wrote one page in her usual plain, direct hand, and she said yes, and she said it without hesitation, and without condition, and without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. She gave her notice to Mr. Hargrove, who received it with the mildly surprised expression of a man who had not been paying quite enough attention to have anticipated this, and she thanked him sincerely, and she meant the thanks, because he had not been a bad employer. He had simply been an ordinary one, and she was discovering, not entirely ordinary herself. Mrs. Penny made the traveling cake on Tuesday evening without being asked. She put it in a tin and pressed it into Clara's hands on Wednesday morning and said it was for the journey, and that the tin could be returned when she had the opportunity, and they both knew the tin was not coming back, and were both satisfied with that. George carried her trunk to the gate on the morning of December the 1st. He set it down and stood back with the particular stance of someone who has done what was needed and is now present for whatever comes next. Agnes appeared at the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara with bright, slightly wet eyes, and then looked very firmly at a spot on the doorframe and controlled herself with the effort of a young woman who had decided she was not going to cry and was actively losing the argument with herself. Clara went to Agnes and pressed her hand, which was the right thing, and Agnes received it as such. The carriage came at 9 o'clock. The same black carriage, the same crest, the same dark horses. Clara recognized it as if it were an old friend, which she supposed, in its way, it now was. She climbed in. She put the tin of cake beside her, and her small bag at her feet, and her coat across her knees. The door closed. The carriage moved. She watched the Hargrove gate through the window. She watched the lane and the bend with the bare elms. She watched them pass behind her, and she turned forward, to the road ahead, which was where the road was now. She arrived at Ashford Hall in the middle of the afternoon, the winter light already going golden and long, and very fine, casting long shadows across the frost-white east lawn, and throwing the hall's stone face into soft relief against a pale sky. It was larger than she had imagined, and warmer looking than she had expected. She had pictured it cold and imposing, and it was certainly imposing, but there were lights in many windows, and smoke from the chimneys, and the general sense of a house in which people actually lived, with all the warmth and accumulated disorder that living always involves. Nora, the housekeeper, met her in the entrance hall. She was a woman perhaps 60, efficient and genuine, and she took Clara's coat and her bag and led her upstairs with the ease of someone who knew their house completely and could move through it with their eyes closed. She showed Clara to the room at the end of the second-floor corridor, east-facing, twice the size of anything Clara had occupied, a proper wardrobe, a bed with fresh white linen, a chair by the window, and a writing desk positioned to catch the full morning light from the east-facing window. On the desk was a book. Clara went to it. She picked it up. Marcus Aurelius, in a new edition, the leather deep brown and unscratched, the pages clean and white, the spine not yet cracked from reading. Someone had placed it there with intention, and some thought about where it would be found. She stood at the desk holding the book, and she heard, from somewhere in the corridor, a familiar tread. She turned. Edward was in the doorway. He was dressed well, a good dark coat, proper shoes, his collar pressed. He had color in his face that had not been there on the bench or in the cottage, and he was standing fully upright without any of the careful management of pain she had been accustomed to watching for. He stood in the doorway, the way a man stands in a doorway when he is in his own house, and has the right to stand there without explanation. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "welcome to Ashford Hall." "Thank you, Edward," she said. He looked at the book in her hands. "He put that there himself," he said. "He asked me what I thought you would make of it. I told him you would find it exactly right." Clara looked at the book. She thought about her father's copy, worn soft from years of reading, now in the breast pocket of a coat she had helped button on the morning of a brilliant December day. She thought about a bench and a gate and a sound in the dark before morning. She thought about 12 days of fire and soup and tea and conversation in a small warm room. She set the new book on the desk, open. The spine broke cleanly and smoothly. The first pages lay flat in the winter light coming through the east-facing window. "Tell him," she said, "that when he is ready, there is no hurry. I will be here." "I will tell him," Edward said. He moved away from the doorway. His footsteps went down the corridor, steady and even, the footsteps of a man who knew where he was going. Clara stood at the desk. The afternoon light was golden on the open pages. Outside the window, the east lawn lay frost-white and perfectly still, and the bare trees at the boundary held their branches against the pale sky, and somewhere in the grounds a bird was singing, with the bright, particular gladness of a bird that is simply pleased to be in a tree. She did not know what came next. She had never been someone who claimed to know what came next, not about herself, and certainly not about the complicated, careful, not yet finished relationship between a father and a son, who were only at the beginning of a very long road back toward each other. She did not know if the Duke's warmth would grow or remain the small, contained thing she had seen the edge of. She did not know if the two young cousins would be easy or difficult children to teach, or interesting or dull, or whether the household would fit her the way she was beginning to believe it might. She knew only one thing, and it was the same thing she had known on every morning of the last 12 days, what was directly in front of her. Right now, directly in front of her, was a desk with good morning light and a new book waiting to be read. She sat down. She turned to the first page. She began.